Welcome to Tales by Imon. Tonight's story is The Last Passenger on the Midnight Train. The rain came down in sheets, plastering itself against the grand, arched windows of Northwood Central Station. It was the kind of relentless, soul-dampening downpour that made the world feel small and enclosed, a forgotten terrarium fogged with condensation. Inside, the cavernous main hall echoed with the ghosts of journeys past, the distant clang of a forgotten bell, the hiss of steam that no longer powered the engines, and the hushed murmurs of the few souls waiting for the midnight departure. My name is Jack Donovan, and I was one of them. Once, I chased stories. As an investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune, I lived on adrenaline and deadlines, my world a chaotic symphony of ringing phones, confidential sources, and the satisfying click of a camera shutter capturing a truth someone wanted to hide. But that life had a cost. A story got too big, too dangerous, and the fallout left me scorched. Now, I chased anonymity. I was running, not from the law, but from the shadow of my own past, hoping a quiet town in the Pacific Northwest could offer the solace a bustling city never could. The Argent Express was my vessel of escape. It wasn't a sleek, modern bullet train. It was a relic, a serpent of polished steel and faded glory that snaked its way through the forgotten veins of the country. Its final departure was always at the stroke of midnight, a lonely route for lonely people. Perfect for me. My ticket was for a sleeper car, but I found myself in the half-empty observation car, watching the rain distort the city lights into a blurry watercolor painting. The car was trimmed with dark mahogany, the seats upholstered in a worn, burgundy velvet that smelled faintly of dust and old tobacco. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track was a hypnotic drumbeat, a lullaby for the weary. There were only 3 other passengers in the car with me, a young soldier in uniform, asleep with his head against the window, a grandmotherly woman knitting a seemingly endless scarf, and a businessman in a wrinkled suit, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of his laptop. The final boarding call echoed through the PA system, a disembodied voice warning that the doors of the Argent Express were closing. I took a slow sip of my lukewarm coffee from a paper cup, feeling the familiar tug of solitude settle over me. This was it. The point of no return. And then, I saw her. She appeared at the far end of the platform, a frantic silhouette against the storm. Even from a distance, her urgency was palpable. She ran, not with the easy gait of someone late for a meeting, but with the desperate, panicked sprint of someone being pursued. A long, dark trench coat billowed behind her, and a flash of emerald green from a scarf at her neck was the only spot of color in the monochrome night. In one hand, she clutched a vintage, dark leather briefcase. Her other hand held a ticket, a small white flag of surrender to the journey ahead. A conductor, his face etched with impatience, stood by the door of my car, pocket watch in hand. "That's it, folks. We're rolling out." He began to pull the heavy door closed. "Wait," she cried, her voice thin but clear, carried by the wind. The conductor paused, his duty warring with his schedule. He looked at her, then at his watch. With a heavy sigh, he held the door open just enough for her to slip through. She stumbled into the car, breathless, her chest heaving. Rainwater dripped from the hem of her coat, creating a small, dark puddle on the carpeted floor. She leaned against the door for a moment, her eyes shut, as the train gave a final, groaning lurch and began to pull away from the station. The city lights of Northwood began their slow, backward dance. She finally opened her eyes. They were wide and startlingly gray, like a stormy sea, and they darted around the car, assessing every face, every shadow. Her gaze swept past the sleeping soldier, the knitting woman, and the focused businessman. Then her eyes met mine. It was only for a second, but in that fleeting moment, I saw not just panic, but a profound, terrifying fear. It was a look I'd seen before, in the eyes of witnesses about to testify, in the faces of people whose lives were about to unravel. She quickly looked away, pulling her coat tighter around herself as if for protection. She walked down the aisle, her heels sinking softly into the worn carpet. She chose a seat just 2 rows ahead of me, on the opposite side, tucking the leather briefcase carefully between her feet and the wall of the train. She never once let go of the handle. For the next hour, I watched her. It was an old habit, a journalist's instinct to observe, to piece together a story from fragments of behavior. She didn't read. She didn't look at her phone. She simply stared out the window into the inky blackness, her reflection a pale, ghostly mask superimposed over the rushing, rain-lashed landscape. Her knuckles, wrapped around the handle of the briefcase, were white. Every time the train rattled over a switch or the conductor walked through the car, her entire body would tense, her shoulders hunching as if expecting a blow. Who was she? And what was in that briefcase that she guarded with such fierce, fearful devotion? My mind, rusty from months of disuse, began to spin theories. Was she a corporate whistleblower carrying incriminating documents? A woman fleeing a dangerous relationship? Or something else entirely? The nameplate on the briefcase was polished brass, and from my angle, I could just make out the initials, EV. The train picked up speed, its horn a mournful cry that tore through the night. We were swallowed by the darkness of the countryside, the only light coming from the flickering overhead lamps in the car. The rhythm of the tracks was having its effect, and my eyelids felt heavy. I allowed myself to drift, the woman in the trench coat becoming a part of the train's monotonous song. I was jolted awake by a sudden, jarring shudder. The lights in the car flickered violently, died for a full 3 seconds, and then buzzed back to life, casting a sickly yellow glow. The train was passing through a tunnel, the sound of the wheels amplifying into a deafening roar against the confined stone walls. The soldier snorted in his sleep. The woman continued her knitting, her needles clicking in a steady, unbothered rhythm. When we emerged from the tunnel back into the open, rainy night, my eyes instinctively went to the woman in the trench coat. The seat was empty. I sat up straighter, my senses suddenly on high alert. Her coat was gone. Her scarf was gone. She was gone. I scanned the rest of the car. No sign of her. Had she gone to the restroom? Or perhaps to the dining car, though it was surely closed at this hour. I waited. 1 minute passed. Then 5. Then 10. The steady beat of the train felt different now, more ominous, like a ticking clock. My curiosity, that old, dangerous friend, got the better of me. I stood up, stretching my legs as a pretense, and walked slowly down the aisle. As I passed her empty seat, my eyes fell to the floor. Tucked away, almost completely hidden in the shadow beneath the seat, was the briefcase. She had left it behind. The one thing she had guarded with every fiber of her being was now sitting abandoned on the floor of a train hurtling through the dead of night. It made no sense. A person so terrified of losing something wouldn't simply forget it. I stood there for a long moment, the low hum of the train filling the silence. The businessman was now asleep, his laptop dark. The only other person awake was the knitting woman, but she seemed lost in her own world. No one else had noticed the woman's disappearance. No one else knew about the briefcase. My instincts screamed at me to walk away, to go to my sleeper car and forget I ever saw her. My new life was supposed to be quiet, free of complications, free of mysteries. But the old Jack Donovan, the man who lived to uncover secrets, was stirring within me. Hesitantly, I bent down. The leather was cool and smooth beneath my fingertips. The brass latches were closed. I glanced around one last time. No one was watching. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached for the handle. What secrets did this case hold? And where in the world was the last passenger on the midnight train? The world seemed to narrow down to the space around that abandoned leather briefcase. The rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks, which had been a soothing backdrop just moments before, now sounded like a ticking clock, each second pulling me further into a story I had no business being a part of. My first instinct, the one that screamed self-preservation, was to alert the conductor, find him, point to the bag, and wash my hands of the whole affair. It was someone else's property, someone else's problem. I had enough of my own. But the journalist in me, the stubborn, curious ghost I was trying to exorcise, wouldn't let it go. People like Eleanor Vance, people with that specific brand of primal fear in their eyes, didn't just carelessly abandon the one thing they were protecting. Leaving it behind was an action as loud and deliberate as a gunshot. It meant something had happened to her. Something that made her let go. With a final, furtive glance around the car, I made a decision. I bent down, my joints protesting, and picked up the briefcase. It was heavier than I expected, solid and dense. The leather was cool and worn smooth in places from years of use. I walked back to my seat, my movements stiff and unnatural, convinced that every eye was on me. But no one stirred. The soldier slept on, the businessman snored softly, and the old woman's knitting needles continued their silent, rhythmic dance. I felt like a thief, my heart pounding a guilty rhythm against my ribs. I slid into my own seat and placed the briefcase on the velvet upholstery beside me. Under the dim, buttery light of the reading lamp, I could examine it more closely. It was beautifully crafted, likely decades old, with reinforced corners and 2 sturdy brass latches on the front. The initials EV were elegantly embossed in gold leaf just below the handle. Eleanor Vance. The name suited her. It had an old-world grace, a touch of class that matched her appearance, despite her obvious distress. I tried the latches. They were locked. Not with a key, but with a pair of 3-digit combination dials, one for each latch. My hopes sank. Without the combination, it was just a handsome leather box. For a moment, I considered forcing them open, but that felt like a line I wasn't ready to cross. It would be an act of destruction, an admission that I was no longer a passive observer but an active participant. Still, my fingers idly toyed with the dials. What would the combination be? Birthdays? Anniversaries? Meaningless numbers? I tried a few obvious ones. 123 000 747. Nothing. The latches held firm. The briefcase was a vault, and whatever secret it held was safe from my prying eyes. For now. Frustrated, I leaned my head back against the seat. If I couldn't get answers from the briefcase, I had to focus on the owner. Where did she go? The car wasn't that large. There were doors at either end, one leading forward towards the dining and sleeper cars, the other leading back towards the coach cars. And there was a small restroom tucked into a closet-like space near the forward door. That was the most logical place to start. I stood up again, this time with more purpose. I walked to the front of the car and tried the door to the restroom. The handle turned easily in my hand. It wasn't locked. I pushed it open and peered inside. The small compartment was empty, clean, and smelled faintly of disinfectant. The metallic gleam of the sink and toilet was undisturbed. A small, frosted window looked out into the black, rain-swept night. No Eleanor. I closed the door, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. My next stop was the conductor. I needed information, but I had to be careful how I asked for it. Prowling through the train in the middle of the night, asking about a missing passenger was a good way to draw the kind of attention I was trying to avoid. I found him in the next car forward, a mostly empty dining car where the tables were already set for breakfast. He was a man named Sam, according to his name tag, with a tired face, a neatly trimmed gray mustache, and eyes that had seen a million miles of track. He was sipping from a thermos and filling out some paperwork. "Excuse me," I said, trying to sound casual. He looked up, his expression weary but professional. "Can I help you?" "Yeah, just a quick question." The woman who boarded right at the last second back in Northwood, dark coat, green scarf. "Did you happen to see where she went? I think she might have dropped something near my seat." It was a weak lie, but the best I could come up with on the spot. Sam took a slow sip from his thermos, his eyes scanning my face. "Can't say I did. She bought her ticket at the counter just before we left. One way to Silver Creek. Paid cash." He shrugged. "Once they're on board, folks move around. As long as they have a ticket, it's not my job to keep tabs on them. You checked the lounge car." "Haven't yet," I said. "Silver Creek, huh? That's not much of a town, is it?" "It's a stop," Sam said non-committally. "We get there around 5 a.m. Just a flag stop, really. If she's not in her seat then, we'll make an announcement." He turned back to his paperwork, the conversation clearly over. I thanked him and walked away, his words echoing in my mind. Silver Creek. A flag stop. A place you went to disappear. And she paid cash. Another move designed to leave no trail. This was getting more complicated by the minute. She wasn't just a nervous traveler, she was a ghost, deliberately erasing her own footprints. I returned to the observation car, the briefcase sitting on my seat like a silent accusation. My little chat with the conductor had only deepened the mystery. She hadn't gone to a sleeper car, because she didn't have a ticket for one. And it was unlikely she was just wandering the train. The feeling that something was wrong intensified, prickling the back of my neck. Driven by a hunch, I walked back to her empty seat. An investigator always returns to the scene. You never know what you might have missed in the first pass. I ran my hand over the velvet seat, then knelt to get a better look at the floor where the briefcase had been. It was clean, save for a few dust bunnies. I was about to give up and return to my seat when my fingers brushed against something wedged deep in the crease between the seat cushion and the backrest. I pinched the material and pulled. It was a small, stiff piece of cardstock. A luggage claim ticket from Northwood Central Station. The numbers on it were crisp and black, but it was the back that made me freeze. Scrawled in a hurried, slightly shaky handwriting were a series of numbers, followed by a single word. The note read, 815. Peregrine. What did it mean? 815. Was it the combination to the briefcase? My heart leaped at the possibility. And the word, Peregrine. Like the falcon. It was strange, specific. It felt less like a random word and more like a code, a signpost pointing toward a secret I couldn't yet see. I pocketed the ticket and hurried back to my seat, my mind racing. I sat down, the heavy briefcase feeling like a bomb on the seat next to me. With trembling fingers, I picked up the first combination lock. I carefully turned the dials. 815. I held my breath and pulled the latch. It didn't open. Disappointment washed over me, cold and immediate. I tried the second lock, dialing in the same numbers. 815. I tugged on it. It remained stubbornly shut. It wasn't the combination. The numbers and the word meant something else. I was holding two pieces of a puzzle with no idea how they fit together, while the person who held the key was missing, swallowed by the belly of the speeding train. I was no longer on the run from my old life. It felt as though my old life had reached out and pulled me back in, right here on the Argent Express, in the middle of a storm-tossed night. The failure of the combination lock was more than just a momentary setback. It was a wall. I sat there in the humming silence of the observation car, the two clues in my possession feeling more like riddles than answers. A locked briefcase I couldn't open, and a cryptic note, 815. Peregrine, that unlocked nothing. My journalistic instincts told me the two were connected, a lock and a key that simply refused to fit. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and tried to break it down logically, the way I would with a complex financial scandal or a political cover-up. First, the numbers. 815. It wasn't a combination. So, what else? A date. August 15th, or maybe January 5th. 1985. Without context, it was meaningless. It could be a flight number, a hotel room, an apartment address, a Bible verse. The possibilities were endless and, therefore, useless. Then the word, Peregrine. My mind immediately went to the peregrine falcon, the fastest animal on the planet. A predator. Was it a symbol of speed, of power, of something being hunted? Or was it a name? It could be a code name for a project, a person, even a place. The Peregrine Building. The Hotel Peregrine. It had a classic, almost stately ring to it. And what about the luggage claim ticket itself? There was a bag waiting at Northwood Central. A bag she couldn't take with her. Was it a decoy? Or did it hold another piece of the puzzle? The train was moving further away from it with every passing second, making that clue impossible to pursue. I was stuck. With the briefcase locked and the note a cipher, my only viable lead was the woman herself. Eleanor Vance was missing on a moving train. A closed system. She couldn't have just vanished into thin air. She had to be somewhere on one of these cars. My previous search had been cursory, hesitant. Now, I needed to be thorough. Leaving the briefcase on my seat, covering it with my jacket to make it look like my own luggage, I began a systematic search of the Argent Express. I started by moving backward, toward the tail of the train. I passed through two more coach cars, the air growing staler, thick with the smell of recycled air and sleeping bodies. Under the dim blue glow of the nightlights, passengers were slumped in their seats, a gallery of anonymous dreamers. I scanned every face, looking for that flash of emerald green or the silhouette of her dark coat. Nothing. She wasn't hiding among the coach class passengers. I reached the final car, the caboose, its back door showing only the darkness of the receding tracks. A dead end. I turned around and began the long walk forward, my sense of dread growing with each step. I passed through my own car again, my heart giving a slight jump as I saw the lump of my jacket still safely covering the briefcase. I continued forward, past the dining car where the conductor, Sam, was now gone, and into the hushed, narrow corridor of the first sleeper car. The atmosphere here was completely different. The open seating of the coach cars was replaced by a claustrophobic hallway lined with the closed doors of private cabins. The only sounds were the hum of the train and the soft creak of the car swaying on the tracks. I felt like an intruder, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the thin runner carpet. Behind each of these doors, people were sleeping, oblivious. Was she behind one of them? Had she slipped into an empty room? Or worse, had she been pulled into one? The thought sent a chill down my spine. I walked the length of two sleeper cars, a ghost in a metal tube, peering at the small brass numbers on each door, listening for any sound from within. I heard nothing but the occasional snore or a muffled cough. It was a pointless exercise. I couldn't just start knocking on doors. At the juncture between the second and third sleeper car, I nearly collided with a porter. He was an older gentleman, probably in his late 60s, with kind, tired eyes and a neatly pressed uniform. His name tag read Arthur. He was carrying a small tray with a glass of water and some folded towels. He gave me a polite, weary smile. "Can I help you find your room, sir?" "Oh no, I'm just stretching my legs," I lied, trying to look nonchalant. "Couldn't sleep." I decided to take a chance. "Say, you have a good memory for faces?" Arthur chuckled softly. "After 40 years on this line, I remember faces I've forgotten I've seen. What are you looking for?" "A woman. She boarded at the last minute in Northwood. Dark trench coat, green scarf, she looked scared. I saw her in the observation car earlier, but now she's gone." Arthur's brow furrowed in concentration. He leaned against the wall, thinking. Dark coat, green scarf. No, sir. Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description back here. The sleepers are all accounted for. Most of my passengers turned in hours ago. He paused, then his eyes sharpened with a new thought. But it's funny you mentioned someone looking scared. My pulse quickened. Why is that? There was another gentleman, maybe half an hour after we departed Northwood. Came back here asking questions. He wasn't a sleeper passenger. Said he was looking for the baggage car. Seemed real agitated, jumpy. Kept looking over his shoulder. A new player. My mind raced. What did he look like? Average height, wore a plain gray suit, but it didn't fit him right. Looked like a rental. The thing I remember was his hands. Fiddled with a small silver lighter, over and over. Click, flick, click, flick. Never lit anything with it. Just a nervous habit. The pieces were starting to shift, forming a new, more dangerous picture. Eleanor wasn't just running from a threat she'd left behind in Northwood. The threat was here, on the train with us. This man in the ill-fitting suit was looking for something. Or someone. The baggage car, I said, thinking aloud. Where is it? It's the very first car, right behind the engine, Arthur explained. But it's access restricted. Staff only. There's nothing for a passenger up there. And this man just accepted that and left? Arthur shook his head. He argued with me for a minute. Said he had a sensitive package that he needed to check on. I told him he'd have to wait until his stop, just like everyone else. He wasn't happy about it, but he went back toward the front of the train. I thanked Arthur, my mind reeling. I walked back the way I came, the quiet corridors of the sleeper cars no longer feeling empty, but charged with a hidden menace. The man in the gray suit. The silver lighter. He was looking for something. Was it the briefcase? Or was it Eleanor herself? Had he found her? I returned to my seat in the observation car. The jacket was still there, the briefcase still hidden beneath it. But it no longer felt like a box of secrets. It felt like bait. I was sitting on the one thing this man was likely searching for. My anonymity was gone, blown to pieces. I wasn't just an observer anymore. Whether I liked it or not, I was a player in this deadly game. My eyes drifted to the front of the car, looking down the long, connected spine of the train. Past the dining car, past the sleepers, all the way to the front. The one place I hadn't looked. The one place a passenger wasn't supposed to go. The baggage car. It was a restricted area, a metal box full of luggage and freight. It was also the perfect place to hide someone. Or something. The man in the gray suit was interested in it. Now, so was I. The knowledge that another man was on the train, a predator actively hunting, changed the entire equation. The game was no longer passive. I wasn't just solving a puzzle. I was in the middle of the board, and I didn't even know the rules. Every shadow in the observation car seemed to lengthen, and every creak of the train sounded like a footstep. My quiet escape to the Pacific Northwest had officially derailed, plunging into a ravine of intrigue I had tried so hard to leave behind. Staying put was no longer an option. Hiding behind my coffee cup and pretending I hadn't seen anything would not keep me safe. Not when I was in possession of the very thing this man was likely after. My first move was to secure the briefcase. Carrying it with me was out of the question. It would make me an immediate target. I slid it out from under my jacket, and with as much subtlety as I could manage, I placed it inside my own larger duffel bag, which I brought into the car with me. I zipped it up, burying the leather case under a change of clothes and a worn paperback. I then heaved the duffel onto the overhead luggage rack. It was a flimsy bit of concealment, but it was better than nothing. It was out of sight. To any casual observer, I was just another passenger with his luggage. With the briefcase secured, I could focus on my next, much riskier move, getting to the baggage car. Arthur the porter had been clear. It was a restricted area. But it was also the last place left to look. The one location that connected both Eleanor's disappearance and the mysterious man in the gray suit. I set off, my journey to the front of the train feeling entirely different this time. Before, I was an investigator. Now, I felt like prey. I moved with a heightened awareness, every sense on fire. The sleeping passengers I passed were no longer just anonymous travelers. They were potential witnesses, or worse, one of them could be the man I was trying to avoid. I kept my head down, my gaze sweeping the length of each car before I entered. The sleeper cars were the worst. The narrow corridors felt like a trap, a long, tight bottleneck with nowhere to hide if I was confronted. The soft glow from the floor-level lighting cast long, dancing shadows that played tricks on my eyes. Twice, a cabin door opened, and I had to duck into an alcove, my heart hammering, only to see a bleary-eyed passenger heading for the restroom. I held my breath until they were gone, the scent of their soap or perfume lingering in the air like a ghost. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the end of the last passenger car. Before me was a heavy metal door, different from the others. It had a small, circular window of reinforced glass and a stark, black and yellow sign that read, "Crew only and no passenger access." This was the barrier. A wave of cold industrial air seeped from under the door, carrying the faint smell of engine oil. The muffled roar of the engine was noticeably louder here. The door was, as expected, locked. A simple keycard scanner was mounted next to the handle. I was stumped. I had no keycard, and no legitimate reason to be here. My only option was to wait and hope for an opportunity. I flattened myself against the wall in the vestibule, the vibrating, swaying space between cars, concealed by the deep shadows outside the main cabin lights. The rhythmic ka-thunk of the wheels was a maddening drumbeat marking the slow passage of time. After 10 minutes that felt like an hour, my luck changed. I heard footsteps approaching from the passenger side. It was Sam, the conductor. He looked preoccupied, a clipboard in his hand. He didn't even glance in my direction. He swiped his card, the lock clicked open, and he pulled the heavy door inward, disappearing into the forbidden corridor. He didn't close it all the way. It swung slowly shut, but before the latch could click, I darted from the shadows, my hand catching the cold metal edge. I slipped through the gap, pulling it silently closed behind me. I was in. The environment shifted instantly. The passenger train's attempt at comfort was gone, replaced by raw, industrial function. I was in a narrow, brightly lit corridor with metal-grate flooring. Exposed pipes and wiring ran along the ceiling. To my left were the closed doors of what I assumed were crew quarters or storage closets. The roar of the engine was a constant, physical presence now, vibrating through the soles of my shoes. I moved forward cautiously, my footsteps loud against the metal floor. I could hear the faint sound of a radio playing from behind one of the doors. I crept past, holding my breath. The corridor twisted, and at the end of it was my destination, a massive, sliding metal door. The baggage car. There was no handle on my side, only a heavy latch that was currently disengaged. But there was a small, grimy window set at eye level, exactly as I'd hoped. I wiped a clean circle on the glass with the sleeve of my shirt and peered inside. The baggage car was a cavernous, dimly lit space. A few caged light bulbs hanging from the ceiling cast long, eerie shadows that swayed in time with the train's motion. The car was packed with a chaotic jumble of luggage, wooden crates, and canvas mailbags. Everything seemed to be in its place, just a mountain of inanimate objects on their way to some far-off destination. But then my eyes adjusted to the gloom, and I noticed the signs of a frantic search. One of the large wooden crates had been pried open, its lid splintered and hanging from a single hinge. A stack of mailbags had been slashed open, their contents, letters and small packages, spilling out across the floor like entrails. Someone had been looking for something with brutal, desperate force. The man with the silver lighter. My gaze swept the car, looking for any sign of Eleanor. I saw nothing. My heart sank with a mixture of relief and disappointment. I was about to turn away, to label this another dead end, when I saw it. At the far end of the car, half hidden behind a towering stack of vintage travel trunks, was a small splash of color on the dull metal floor. Emerald green. It was her scarf. It was lying in a crumpled heap, a vibrant green teardrop in a world of gray and brown. And just a few feet away from it, I saw a dark, ugly stain spreading out from beneath the trunks. A thick, viscous pool that was too dark to be water. In the sickly yellow light, I couldn't be sure what it was. Oil, grease, or blood. My stomach clenched. She had been here. Something violent had happened here. But where was she now? I scanned the car again, my eyes darting into every shadow, behind every crate. There was no sign of her. Only the scarf and the stain, a silent, horrifying testament to a struggle. I was so focused on the scene inside the car that I didn't register the sound at first. It was faint, barely audible over the roar of the engine. A soft scuff of a shoe on the metal grating behind me. My blood ran cold. I froze, my face pressed against the glass. Someone was in the corridor with me. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, were getting closer. I was trapped. The door to the baggage car was locked from the other side, and the corridor behind me led straight to the person who was now hunting for me. Panic is a cold, sharp thing. It seized my throat as the footsteps rounded the corner behind me, deliberate and confident on the metal grating. My mind went blank for a full second, a void of pure terror. I was trapped. The baggage car door was an impassable wall in front of me, and the source of the footsteps was closing the corridor behind me. My old life had been filled with close calls and dangerous situations, but this felt different, more immediate, more final. This was the primal fear of a cornered animal. Instinct took over. My eyes darted to the left, to the row of closed crew doors. They were my only chance. I lunged for the nearest handle, my palms sweating, and twisted. Locked. The footsteps were closer now, perhaps only 20 feet away. I scrambled to the next door, my movements clumsy with haste. I twisted the handle. It was also locked. A wave of despair washed over me. This was it. I was going to be found in a restricted area, staring into a scene of violence. Just as the first figure was about to come into view, my hand found the third handle. It was a simple, round knob, cool to the touch. I turned it. It gave way with a soft, metallic click. The door opened inward. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself into the opening, pulling the door shut behind me just as the footsteps passed the spot where I had been standing. The latch clicked into place with a sound that was deafening in the sudden, enclosed silence. I found myself in a small, pitch-black supply closet. The air was thick with the scent of industrial-strength cleaner and laundered linen. I stood perfectly still, my back pressed against a stack of what felt like folded tablecloths, my breathing shallow, trying to make myself as small as possible. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a wild drum in the suffocating darkness. The footsteps stopped directly outside my hiding spot. I heard two distinct voices, one of which was vaguely familiar. "This is the place," a gruff voice said. It was the man in the ill-fitting gray suit, the one Arthur had described. His voice was low and devoid of warmth. "Mess needs to be cleaned up before the next shift change." "What about the woman?" a second voice asked, laced with anxiety. I recognized this one. It was Sam, the conductor. My stomach turned to ice. The one person with authority on this train, the one person I might have turned to, was involved. The circle of trust had shrunk to a single point, me. "She's been dealt with," the man in gray said dismissively. "She's no longer a problem. The package she was carrying, however, is. She didn't have it on her when we intercepted her." "So it's still on the train?" Sam asked, his voice strained. "She was clever," the man in gray mused, and I could hear the maddening, repetitive click of his silver lighter. Click, flick, click, flick. She must have realized she was being followed. She passed it off. Had to be one of the other passengers in that last car she was in. The soldier, the old woman, or the journalist. My blood ran cold. He knew who I was. Or at least, what I used to be. They hadn't just been watching Eleanor, they had been watching everyone around her. "We'll handle it at Silver Creek," the man in gray continued, his voice hardening. "It's a flag stop in the middle of nowhere. Perfect. You make sure the train makes an unscheduled 10-minute stop for a minor mechanical issue. That will give my associates time to board and conduct a thorough search of the car and its passengers. No one gets off until we find it." There was a jangle of keys, and the heavy grinding sound of the baggage car door sliding open. "Now let's take care of this," the man said. "I don't like loose ends." The two of them stepped into the baggage car, and the door slid partially shut behind them, leaving a narrow gap. Through the crack of my closet door, I could see a sliver of the scene, the man in gray and Sam standing over the dark stain on the floor, their voices now muffled and indistinct. This was my chance. My only chance. They were distracted. With a level of silence I didn't know I possessed, I slowly turned the knob on the closet door. I pulled it open just enough to slip through, my body moving with a fluid terror. I didn't dare look back toward the baggage car. I just fled, my soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper on the metal grate floor. The journey back through the crew corridor was a nightmare of self-control. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to sprint back to the relative safety of the passenger areas. But I forced myself to move at a deliberate, silent pace. I slipped through the crew access door, which Sam had thankfully left unlocked, and found myself back in the hushed, carpeted hallway of the sleeper cars. The transition was surreal. I had just come from the train's dark, violent heart, and now I was surrounded again by the illusion of peaceful travel. Sleeping passengers, unaware that the conductor they trusted was complicit in an assault, or worse. The entire train felt like a cage, a beautifully appointed trap rolling inexorably toward a destination called Silver Creek, where more men were waiting. I finally made it back to the observation car. It was still empty, a silent stage where the drama had begun. I collapsed into my seat, my body trembling with a cocktail of adrenaline and fear. I looked at the overhead rack where my duffel bag sat. The briefcase hidden within it was no longer just a mystery. It was a death sentence. They knew who I was. They were going to search everyone. When they found it in my possession, they wouldn't ask questions. I would be dealt with, just like Eleanor. I looked at my watch. The glowing hands read 3:55 a.m. Sam had said we'd arrive at Silver Creek around 5 a.m. That gave me 1 hour. 1 hour to figure out what was in that briefcase. 1 hour to find something inside it that could save my life. The risk of leaving it locked was now infinitely greater than the risk of breaking it open. My quest for a quiet life was over. Now, it was a fight for any life at all. I stood up, reached into the overhead rack, and pulled down my duffel bag. My hands were shaking as I unzipped it and pulled out the cold, heavy leather briefcase. I placed it on the seat before me. The brass combination locks gleamed mockingly in the dim light. I had no idea how I was going to get them open, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't getting off this train without knowing the secret Eleanor Vance had died to protect. 1 hour. The deadline hung in the air, as tangible and oppressive as the humidity in the rattling train car. 60 minutes until this moving sanctuary became a hunting ground. My gaze was fixed on the briefcase sitting on the seat before me. It was no longer just a piece of luggage, it was Pandora's box, and my only hope was that it contained a weapon, not just more monsters. My mind, sharpened by the imminent threat, went into overdrive. The combination locks were a dead end. Brute force was too risky, too loud. Smashing the latches with my heel or a heavy object would echo through the quiet car and bring the very attention I was trying to avoid. I needed leverage, a tool. Something small and discreet. I rummaged through my duffel bag, my hands searching for anything useful. My fingers closed around a familiar object on my keychain, a small, Swiss Army-style multi-tool, a gift from my father years ago. It was a cheap knockoff, but it had a tiny, flathead screwdriver attachment and a miniature metal file. It wasn't much, but in a world that had shrunk to the confines of this train, it felt like a master key. The observation car, even empty, felt too exposed. Anyone could walk in at any moment. The knitting woman, the soldier, or worse, Sam the conductor making a preliminary sweep. I needed absolute privacy. There was only one place on the train that offered it, the restroom. Gathering the briefcase and my multi-tool, I walked the short distance to the restroom door, my movements deliberately calm. I locked it behind me, the click of the bolt a small, reassuring sound in a world of uncertainty. The compartment was tiny, barely big enough to turn around in, and the constant swaying of the train made the floor feel unstable beneath my feet. I knelt, placing the briefcase on the floor under the harsh, sterile light. I unfolded the small metal file from the multi-tool. It was flimsy, more suited for a broken fingernail than for breaking into a high-quality leather case. I decided to work on the latch mechanism itself, trying to find a weak point. I jammed the tip of the file into the tiny gap where the latch met the body of the briefcase and began to pry. The work was painstaking and excruciatingly slow. The train's vibrations worked against me, causing the tool to slip repeatedly. My knuckles were scraped raw against the brass hardware. The sound of the metal file scraping against the lock was unnervingly loud in the small, enclosed space, and I strained my ears, listening for any sign of someone approaching the door over the constant roar of the train. Every minute that passed was a minute closer to Silver Creek. Sweat beaded on my forehead, dripping into my eyes. After what felt like an eternity of fruitless scraping and prying, I changed tactics. Instead of the latch, I focused on the hinges at the back of the case. They were smaller, perhaps weaker. I wedged the flathead screwdriver attachment into the seam and twisted with all my strength. The cheap metal of the tool bent under the strain. I grunted with effort, putting my body weight into it. There was a sharp, cracking sound. Not the hinge, but my tool. The screwdriver tip had snapped off. Frustration and despair nearly overwhelmed me. I was about to give up, to simply accept my fate, when I noticed something. My attempt to pry the hinge had created a tiny bit of separation, a small gap between the lid and the base of the briefcase. It wasn't much, but it was an opening. I jammed the now blunted end of my broken tool into the gap and heaved upwards. The leather groaned in protest. I heard a faint pop as one of the internal anchor points of the latch gave way. Hope surged through me. I worked the tool back and forth, widening the gap. With a final, desperate wrench, the locking mechanism surrendered. The second latch sprung open with a loud click that echoed like a gunshot in the tiny room. I paused, my breath catching in my throat, listening. Silence. No one had heard. My hands trembling, I lifted the lid. The first thing I saw was a layer of personal effects, a life hastily packed away. A worn copy of Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. A photograph of Eleanor, younger, smiling, standing with an older couple who must have been her parents. Beneath that was a neatly folded geological survey map of a remote region in Nevada. It was the ordinary nature of these items that struck me, the ghost of a normal life that had been violently interrupted. Then I saw what she was truly protecting. Beneath the map was a set of rolled-up architectural blueprints, bound with a rubber band. I unfurled them on the floor. They were complex, highly detailed plans for a massive structure. The title block in the bottom corner read, Project Peregrine, Ethelred Corporation Geothermal Power Station. Peregrine. The word from the note. It was the name of a project. Tucked beside the blueprints was a small, black ledger book. I opened it. The pages were filled with Eleanor's neat, precise handwriting. It was a meticulously kept record of corruption. Dates, offshore account numbers, and names were listed in neat columns. It detailed a systematic process of bribery, material substitution, and safety inspection fraud, all related to Project Peregrine. Millions of dollars had been funneled to shell corporations and public officials to ensure the project was approved and any corners cut would be ignored. And then I saw a name on the list of corporate payoffs that made the air leave my lungs. Marcus Thorne. He was the senior editor at the Chicago Tribune. My editor. The man who had personally killed my last major investigation, a story about construction fraud in the city, and then fired me for unsubstantiated reporting. It hadn't been unsubstantiated. It had been true. And Thorne hadn't just killed it, he had been paid to. This wasn't just a random conspiracy I had stumbled upon. It was the same one. The same network of corruption that had destroyed my career. My past and present had just collided with the force of a train wreck. Tucked into a sleeve inside the ledger was a single flash drive, its plastic casing feeling impossibly heavy in my hand. It likely held the digital proof for everything in the book, and probably much more. A loud, mournful blast from the train's horn cut through the air, signaling our approach to a crossing or a station. I scrambled to check my watch. 4:48 a.m. We would be arriving at Silver Creek in minutes. I was no longer just a man on the run from his past. I was kneeling on the floor of a train restroom, holding the very evidence that could not only avenge a murdered woman but could also reclaim my own shattered life. But this truth was a heavy, dangerous burden. And in just a few minutes, the men who had killed for it once would be boarding the train to do it again. Time had run out. Kneeling on the floor of that tiny rocking restroom, with the secrets of Project Peregrine spread before me, was like holding a live grenade with a pin pulled. The train horn's blast was a starting pistol for a race I was already losing. In minutes, this train would stop, and men whose faces I'd never seen would board with the sole purpose of finding what I now held. My survival, and the exposure of this vast, murderous conspiracy, depended entirely on what I did in the next 10 minutes. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford. My mind, fueled by a surge of pure adrenaline, focused on a single critical task, managing the evidence. Walking off the train with a broken briefcase was an invitation for a bullet. They would be looking for it. I had to separate the intelligence from the vessel. The most vital items were the smallest. The flash drive, a tiny repository of immense corruption, went deep into my sock, a small, hard lump against my ankle. The black ledger was the next priority. It was slim enough to be concealed. I lifted my shirt and slid the book against the small of my back, using my leather belt to hold it tight against my body. It was uncomfortable, a constant, rectangular reminder of the danger I was in, but it was hidden. The bulky blueprints and Eleanor's personal effects were a liability. I quickly rolled up the plans, placed them back inside the briefcase with the photo and the book, and closed the lid. I managed to click the one remaining good latch into place. To a quick glance, it might still look secure. My plan formed with a desperate clarity. I couldn't stay on the train. I couldn't get off at the station like a normal passenger. They would be watching the doors. That left only one option, a ghost's exit. Mr. Gray had given me the key when he'd mentioned the unscheduled stop. The train would be stationary. That was my window. I would have to get off the train between cars, to jump into the darkness and disappear before they even knew I was gone. I flushed the toilet to cover any noise and to provide a reason for my extended stay in the restroom. I took one last look at my reflection in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes wide with a fear I hadn't felt in years. This was it. The story had found me again. I stepped out of the restroom, the briefcase in my hand. I walked calmly back to Eleanor's empty seat and tucked the briefcase underneath it, arranging my jacket over the area to partially conceal it. A decoy. With any luck, it would be the first thing they looked for, buying me precious seconds. I had barely returned to my own seat when I felt the change. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels began to slow, the pitch descending into a long, mournful groan. The brakes hissed, and the gentle rocking of the car eased. Outside the window, the blurred streaks of black and gray began to resolve into the shapes of skeletal trees and the dark, wet earth of an embankment. Then, Sam the conductor's voice, now stripped of all its folksy charm, crackled over the PA system. To the other passengers, it would sound routine. To me, it was a death knell. Ladies and gentlemen, a brief announcement. We apologize for this unscheduled stop. We appear to be experiencing a minor mechanical issue with a signal relay. We expect to be underway again in approximately 10 minutes. For your safety, please remain in your seats and do not attempt to exit the train. Thank you. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, it made my skin crawl. The train slid to a final, complete stop with a gentle sigh of hydraulics. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft drumming of rain on the roof. I peered out the window. We were in the middle of nowhere. A single, rickety concrete platform stood beside the tracks, illuminated by one flickering, yellow bulb. A small wooden shelter with a peeling paint sign that read, Silver Creek, was the only structure in sight. Beyond it, nothing but impenetrable darkness and the faint outline of a forest. Headlights cut through the rain. A dark, unmarked sedan was parked just off the platform. Two doors opened, and two men in dark coats got out. A third, the man in the ill-fitting gray suit, emerged from the front passenger side. They moved with a chilling predatory efficiency, walking directly toward the door of my car. The hunt had begun. I didn't wait to see them board. I stood up and walked, not ran, to the rear of the observation car, to the vestibule that connected it to the next car back. The air here was cold, smelling of rain and ozone. The men's voices were now audible from the front of the car, sharp and low as they spoke to Sam. The exit on the side of the vestibule was a heavy, two-part door with a safety gate. It was designed to be opened only at a station platform. A heavy, stiff latch held it shut. I gripped it with both hands and pulled. It was rusted, stubborn. My hands, slick with sweat, slipped on the cold metal. I could hear them entering the main cabin now. All right, folks, just a routine safety check. We need everyone to remain calm. I threw my shoulder into it, grunting with the effort. The latch resisted, then gave way with a loud metallic shriek that sounded like a scream in the quiet night. I wrestled with the gate, swinging it open. A blast of cold, damp air hit my face. Below me was a steep, gravel-covered embankment that dropped about 6 feet into the darkness. Check the back of the car. I heard Mr. Gray command. There was no more time. I didn't look back. I didn't brace myself. I took a deep, shuddering breath, and with the sound of footsteps hurrying down the aisle behind me, I jumped. For a moment, I was suspended in the cold night air. Then the world came rushing up to meet me. I hit the gravel embankment hard, my ankle twisting painfully beneath me. I tumbled down the sharp, rocky slope, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I came to a stop in a tangle of wet weeds and mud at the bottom. Pain shot through my leg, hot and searing. Above me, a beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness from the open door of the train. I was off the train. I was alive. But I was injured, alone in the dark, and the hunt had just spilled out into the open country. The landing was a brutal collision of flesh and unforgiving earth. A supernova of pain exploded in my left ankle, and I tumbled down the steep, gravel-strewn embankment, my descent a chaotic flurry of scraping rocks and tearing fabric. I came to a jarring stop in a muddy ditch at the bottom, the cold, wet reality of my situation hitting me almost as hard as the ground itself. The wind was knocked from my lungs, and for a precious second, all I could do was lie there, gasping, my world reduced to the searing pain in my leg and the taste of mud in my mouth. There, down the embankment, someone jumped. The shout from above sliced through my daze. A powerful beam from a flashlight cut through the rain, sweeping across the gully where I lay. It danced wildly, momentarily blinding me before moving on. They had seen me. The ghost's exit had been a failure. I was now a confirmed target, exposed and injured. My training, the deeply ingrained instinct to survive that had seen me through riots and war zones, screamed at me to move. I pushed myself up, trying to put weight on my left foot. The pain was a sharp, electric shock that shot up to my knee. I nearly collapsed again. Not broken, I prayed. Please, not broken. Sprained, definitely, badly. Running was impossible. Even walking would be a slow, agonizing ordeal. Another flashlight beam joined the first, their cones of light methodically sweeping the darkness. I could hear them scrambling down the embankment, their movements clumsy but fast. The rain, which had been a miserable nuisance, was now my only ally, its steady drumming masking the sound of my ragged breathing and my clumsy movements as I began to crawl away from the tracks, dragging my useless leg behind me. My target was the dark, imposing wall of the treeline, just 50 feet away. It looked like a mile. Every foot was a battle. Thorns from unseen bushes tore at my hands and clothes. Cold mud seeped into my pants, chilling me to the bone. Behind me, the shouts were getting closer, more organized. Spread out. He can't have gone far. I finally reached the edge of the woods, hauling myself into the relative cover of the undergrowth. The forest was a different world. The open air of the railway was replaced by a claustrophobic tangle of branches and the earthy smell of decay. It was darker here, the flashlight beams struggling to penetrate the thick canopy. But the ground was uneven, a treacherous landscape of exposed roots and slick, moss-covered rocks. I forced myself to my feet, leaning heavily on the trunk of a massive pine tree. I had to move deeper, to put as much distance as I could between myself and them. I began a painful, lurching hobble, using trees as crutches, my ankles screaming in protest with every step. The sounds of pursuit were still clear behind me, the snap of a twig, a muttered curse. Their flashlights cut strobing patterns through the trees, making the shadows leap and twist. I was a wounded animal, and the pack was closing in. I couldn't outrun them, not like this. I had to outthink them. My frantic eyes scanned the terrain. A short distance ahead, I heard a new sound beneath the drumming of the rain, the gurgle of moving water. A creek. It was a long shot, a trope from an old spy movie, but it was the only card I had to play. Water could wash away my scent, hide my tracks. I pushed toward the sound, stumbling through a thicket of ferns that slapped my face with cold, wet leaves. I reached the bank of a small, fast-moving creek. The water was black and looked impossibly cold. Without hesitation, I slid down the muddy bank and plunged my injured foot into the current. The icy shock was so intense it almost made me cry out, but I bit down hard on my lip, stifling the sound. Gritting my teeth, I waded into the stream, the water swirling around my knees. I moved downstream, staying in the water, the rocks on the creek bed slippery and treacherous under my good foot. After about 100 yards, I saw a large, fallen oak tree whose massive root system had been ripped from the earth, creating a dark, hollowed-out cavern underneath. It was perfect. I hauled my numb, shivering body out of the water and crawled into the cramped space, pulling wet leaves and branches over the opening. I huddled in the dark, my body shaking uncontrollably from cold and pain, and I listened. For a long time, there was nothing but the sound of the rain and the creek. Then, I heard their voices, distant and frustrated, from the spot where I had entered the water. They searched the area for a few minutes, their lights playing over the surface of the stream, but my gamble had paid off. They had lost the trail. Just then, a new sound reached me, carried on the night air. The long, mournful horn of the Argent Express. A moment later, I heard the low rumble and the rhythmic clatter as the train began to move, slowly at first, then gaining speed. It was leaving me behind. I was completely and utterly stranded. And so were my hunters. This wasn't a chase anymore. The woods had become the arena, and we were all locked inside. My first coherent thought was for the evidence. I reached into my sock, my numb fingers fumbling for the flash drive. It was still there. I twisted my body, feeling the hard outline of the ledger pressed against my back. It was safe. The knowledge gave me a small, flickering ember of resolve. I was alone, injured, and freezing, in an unfamiliar wilderness, being hunted by at least 3 men who work for a powerful, corrupt organization. My chances were slim to none. But I had the truth. And as I huddled under that fallen tree, with the train's whistle fading into the distance, I knew that getting that truth to the world was the only thing that mattered now. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the night. It wasn't from the tracks. It was deeper in the woods, off to my right. A sharp, clear whistle. It was answered by another, farther to my left. They weren't giving up. They were regrouping, fanning out, beginning a systematic sweep of the forest. My brief respite was over. They were turning this from a chase into a dragnet. I had to move now. Ignoring the agony in my ankle, I pushed myself out of my hiding spot and back into the cold, relentless rain, hobbling deeper into the black heart of the woods. The forest had become a labyrinth of black trees and silver rain. The initial adrenaline of the escape had curdled into a cold, grinding exhaustion that seeped into my bones. My world had contracted to a miserable cycle of pain and endurance. Take a step with my good foot, drag the other, lean against a tree to catch my breath, and listen. Always listen. The whistles of my pursuers had faded, but the silence that replaced them was somehow more menacing. It meant they were organized now, moving quietly, sweeping the woods with a chilling professionalism. My ankle was a throbbing beacon of misery. I had to stop. I found a relatively sheltered spot at the base of a rocky outcropping, a shallow overhang that offered minimal protection from the relentless drizzle. Shivering, I carefully peeled back my wet trouser leg. In the gloom, I could see the swelling. My ankle was puffy and discolored. I gently probed the area, and a jolt of white-hot pain confirmed it was a severe sprain, if not worse. Continuing on like this would be impossible. I needed a brace and a crutch. With numb fingers, I tore a long strip from the lining of my jacket. I wrapped it as tightly as I could around my ankle, gritting my teeth against the pain. The support was flimsy, but it was better than nothing. Next, I searched the forest floor around me, my hands feeling through the wet leaves and mud until I found it, a fallen branch, thick as my wrist and about the right height. It was slick with moss, but it was sturdy. My new companion in this nightmare. Leaning heavily on my makeshift crutch, I pushed onward. My progress was agonizingly slow. Every step was a negotiation with the pain and the treacherous terrain. The dragnet strategy of my hunters meant that moving in a straight line was suicide. I had to be unpredictable. I changed direction frequently, using the sparse cover of gullies and thickets, always moving away from any sound that wasn't the forest itself. Hours bled into one another. The deep, inky black of midnight began to soften into the bruised purple of pre-dawn. The rain eased, replaced by a thick, disorienting fog that clung to the forest floor, muffling sound and reducing visibility to a few yards. The fog was another double-edged sword. It helped to hide me, but it also made it impossible to get my bearings. I had no idea if I was moving toward a road or simply deeper into an endless wilderness. It was during a moment of utter despair, when the cold and pain were about to overwhelm me, that I saw it. Through a gap in the fog, I spotted a shape that was too straight, too angular to be natural. A roofline. I froze, my heart hammering. Was it a trap? Had they set up a base of operations? Or was it a miracle? My need for shelter overrode my fear. I moved toward it with painstaking caution, a ghost in the mist, my crutch making no sound on the soft, pine needle-covered ground. It was a small, dilapidated cabin, built from rough-hewn logs, with a sagging porch and a single grime-covered window. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, a forgotten relic being slowly reclaimed by the forest. I spent 20 minutes circling it, my eyes straining to catch any sign of recent activity. I saw no tracks in the mud, no light in the window, heard no sound from within. Finally, convinced it was empty, I hobbled onto the porch. The wooden boards groaned under my weight. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open, and it swung inward with a long, mournful creak. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of dust, mildew, and cold ashes. A single room was revealed in the gray dawn light filtering through the dirty window. It was sparse and derelict. A rickety wooden table with one chair stood in the center, both coated in a thick layer of dust. In the corner, a rusty pot-bellied stove was connected to a crumbling chimney. Against the far wall was a simple cot with a mattress that was little more than a collection of rags and straw. It wasn't a home. It was a tomb. But it was dry. An overwhelming wave of relief washed over me. I stumbled inside, closing the door behind me, and leaned my crutch against the wall. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I was out of the rain. The silence was absolute. I sank into the dusty chair, my body trembling with exhaustion. I carefully propped my injured ankle up on the cot, the relief from taking weight off it so profound it was almost dizzying. I was safe. Temporarily, at least. I had a place to rest, to think, to form a new plan. My eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, taking in the details of my sanctuary. Cobwebs draped from the rafters like funeral shrouds. The floor was littered with the debris of ages, dead leaves, rodent droppings, a few empty, rust-eaten tin cans. My gaze drifted across the surface of the dusty table, and then I saw it. In the center of the table, sitting starkly against the thick gray dust, was a small, gleaming object. It was perfectly clean, as if it had been placed there only moments ago. A silver lighter. My blood turned to ice. A chill far colder than the rain swept through me. It couldn't be. I leaned forward, my breath catching in my throat. There, on the pristine surface of the lighter, I could just make out a small, ornate engraving. An A intertwined with a C. Ethelred Corporation. It was his. The man in the gray suit. He had been here. The dust around the lighter was undisturbed, meaning it had been left here very recently. This cabin wasn't a random sanctuary I had stumbled upon. It was a known location. A rendezvous point. A hunting lodge for Ethelred's corporate assassins? The horrifying truth crashed down on me. I hadn't found shelter. I had walked straight into the center of the spider's web, and the spider was coming back. The sight of the silver lighter on the dusty table was like a physical blow. The small, fragile sense of security I had clawed from the wilderness evaporated in an instant. This wasn't a sanctuary, it was an outpost. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic prisoner in my chest. Were they outside? Was this some cruel test, leaving bait in a trap to see if the animal was foolish enough to take it? My first instinct was to flee, to burst back out into the fog and the rain. But my rational mind, the journalist's mind, took hold. Running blindly had almost gotten me killed. I needed information. I crept to the single grimy window, my injured ankle protesting the movement. I peered through a small, clean patch on the glass. The world outside was a silent, swirling sea of gray fog. Nothing moved. There was no immediate threat. I turned back to the room, my perspective completely altered. I was no longer a refugee seeking shelter. I was an intruder on enemy territory. The lighter wasn't just an object, it was a sign of their confidence, their arrogance. They used this place. They felt safe here. And that meant there might be other things here, too. Supplies. Information. My search began with a new, feverish intensity. I ran my hands along the rough-hewn log walls, looking for anything out of place. I checked the cot, finding nothing but rotting straw. The pot-bellied stove was cold, filled with old, damp ashes. It was the floor that drew my attention. Near the stone hearth of the stove, one of the rough wooden floorboards seemed to sit slightly higher than the others. I knelt, the ledger in my back digging into my skin. I worked my fingertips into the crack and pulled. The board came up with a low groan of old wood. Beneath it was a small, dark cavity. My pulse quickened. Reaching inside, my hand closed around a waterproof canvas bag. I pulled it out. It was a supply cache. A fixer's go bag. I unzipped it on the floor, my mind racing as I took inventory. The first item was a revelation, a detailed topographical map of the Silver Creek National Forest. It was laminated, professional. My eyes scanned it desperately, and I found what I was looking for: the rail line, the flag stop, and my approximate location. More importantly, about 3 miles west of the cabin, the map showed a thin, dotted line marked Old Logging Road 7. It was an artery leading back to the civilized world. Beneath the map was a small, black two-way radio, its antenna retracted. It was turned off. Next to it, a full box of 9mm ammunition and a compact but well-stocked first aid kit. There were also half a dozen high-protein energy bars. My stomach growled at the sight of them. Finally, at the bottom of the bag, was a set of car keys attached to a plain black fob. Hope, fierce and brilliant, flared in my chest. A map. A vehicle. An escape route. This changed everything. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I had a plan. My hands, trembling slightly, went to the radio. This was a tremendous risk. If I transmitted, they'd know my position instantly. But if I only listened. I switched it on, turning the volume dial to the lowest possible setting. I pressed the cold plastic to my ear. For a moment, there was only static. Then, a voice crackled to life, clear and professional. "Bravo team, report status." "Over." Another voice, tinny and distant, responded. "Bravo at the ridge. No sign of the asset. Trail went cold at the creek. Proceeding east." "Over." "Copy that, Bravo. Sentinel is in position overlooking the logging road. Nothing gets past him. All teams rendezvous at the lodge in 30 mics for new grid assignments." "Over." The lodge. They were talking about this cabin. Sentinel. That sounded like a sniper or a lookout. Overlooking the logging road. They had my escape route covered. And they were coming back here. In 30 minutes. A cold dread washed over me, extinguishing my flicker of hope. I was still trapped. But now I had intelligence. I knew their movements, their positions, their timeline. I tore open an energy bar and devoured it, the rush of sugar and protein a welcome shock to my system. As I ate, I studied the map, my mind racing. The logging road was 3 miles west. The search team, Bravo, was to the east. If I moved now, I could get a head start before they realized the lodge was compromised. I began to gather the essentials: the map, the car keys, the remaining energy bars, the first aid kit, and the radio. I had to leave now. As I stood up, my eyes fell on the silver lighter still sitting on the table, a gleaming symbol of their confidence. I couldn't just run. I had to fight back, even in a small way. I had to turn their arrogance against them. I wouldn't set a fire, the smoke would be a beacon. But I could leave a message. I picked up the lighter. Then, with a sudden inspiration, I took the two-way radio and the lighter and walked to the rusty stove. I opened its small iron door, placed the radio inside, and wedged the lighter between the door and the frame, so that the talk button was permanently depressed. The open channel would broadcast nothing but the silence of the cabin, a dead signal that might confuse them, make them think the radio was malfunctioning. It might buy me a few extra minutes as they tried to figure it out. It was a small act of sabotage, a whisper of defiance. I took one last look around the cabin that had been both my sanctuary and my trap. Using the sleeve of my jacket, I wiped my prints from the table and the doorknob. Then, instead of using the front door, I went to the back of the cabin. A section of the wall, where the chinking between the logs had rotted away, looked loose. I pushed against the logs. One of them gave way, creating a small, rough opening to the foggy wilderness outside. I squeezed through the gap just as I heard a faint crackle from the general direction of the search party. They were getting closer. I didn't look back. With my makeshift crutch in one hand and a map to freedom in my mind, I slipped back into the fog, leaving the silent, booby-trapped cabin behind me. The game had changed. I was no longer just the prey. I was now a player. Leaving the cabin was like plunging back into a cold, hostile ocean after a single gasp of air. The fog was thick, a ghostly blanket that swallowed sound and shape, and for that, I was grateful. It was my shield. My watch read just past 6 a.m. dawn was breaking, but the world was still a monochrome palette of gray and black. The 30-minute countdown had begun. My journey west was a calculated effort, a stark contrast to my earlier panicked flight. I was no longer a directionless fugitive. I was a man with a map, a destination, and a very limited amount of time. The topographical map was etched in my mind: avoid the high ground to the north, stick to the low-lying, densely wooded area, and keep the small, meandering stream on my right. The energy bar had done its work, a welcome fuel for my depleted system, but it couldn't erase the deep, bone-weary exhaustion or the throbbing agony in my ankle. Every step with the makeshift crutch was a carefully balanced act. The forest floor, slick with a carpet of wet pine needles and hidden roots, seemed determined to send me sprawling. My focus narrowed to a simple, brutal rhythm. Move, listen, check my direction, move again. I had to trust that my little act of sabotage with the radio in the stove had worked. I was flying blind now, cut off from their communications, but I hoped the dead air from their own device was sowing confusion, making them waste precious minutes returning to the cabin and trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Every second they wasted was a second I gained. The terrain was grueling. I hauled myself up a short, steep incline, the muscles in my good leg burning, and slid down the other side, sending a small cascade of loose soil and rocks tumbling with me. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat, listening for any sign that I had been heard. Nothing. Only the steady drip of water from the canopy above. After what felt like an eternity, but what my watch told me was nearly 45 minutes, I noticed a change in the woods. The trees began to thin, the dense undergrowth giving way to more open ground. I could see farther, which meant I could also be seen from farther away. I slowed my pace, moving from the cover of one massive tree trunk to the next. Then I saw it. Through a thinning patch of fog, I saw a line that was too straight, too uniform to be natural. It was the edge of the logging road. A raw, muddy scar cut through the forest. I had made it. But this was where the danger was greatest. Sentinel is in position, overlooking the logging road. The words from the radio echoed in my mind. I found a thicket of ferns and low-lying bushes about 20 yards from the edge of the road and concealed myself. My breathing was ragged, my body screaming for rest, but my mind was sharp, focused. I was now the hunter, and my prey was the man who was hunting me. I peered through the leaves, my eyes scanning the opposite side of the road. Sentinel would have the high ground, a position with a clear line of sight. I scanned the ridge that ran parallel to the road. It was a perfect sniper's nest. For 10 minutes, I saw nothing. The fog was beginning to thin further as the sun climbed higher, and patches of weak, watery sunlight were breaking through. It was one of these patches that gave him away. A tiny, brilliant flash of light, no bigger than a spark, glinted from a cluster of rocks on the ridge. It was there and gone in a second. The sun reflecting off a rifle's scope. He was there, approximately 200 yards up the road from my position. Now I knew where he was. The problem remained. The SUV would be parked somewhere along this road, and to get to it, I had to move past him without being seen. I couldn't go back into the woods. The terrain was too difficult. My only path was forward. I needed a diversion. My eyes scanned the ground around me, and I found a handful of loose, fist-sized rocks. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one I had. I took the largest rock, judged the direction and distance, and with a surge of adrenaline, I hurled it as far as I could, not toward Sentinel, but deep into the woods to my left, perpendicular to the road. I ducked down instantly, my heart pounding. A few seconds later, I heard the satisfying crash as the rock landed in the undergrowth, a sound far too loud to be a falling branch. I chanced a glance toward the ridge. I saw movement. A dark shape shifting, the rifle turning to face the new sound. He was distracted. This was my moment. Staying low, I moved from my cover, hobbling and crawling along the deep, muddy ditch that ran alongside the road. I was in his blind spot, below his line of sight. The ditch was filled with stagnant, foul-smelling water and thorny vines that tore at my clothes, but I ignored it. I moved as quickly and silently as my injured body would allow, my eyes fixed on the spot where I knew Sentinel was watching. After 50 agonizing yards, my lungs burning, I risked another look up. I was past him. I kept going, putting another 100 yards between us before I dared to slow down. And then I saw it. Tucked into a small, overgrown clearing just off the road was a dark green, mud-splattered SUV. My ticket out. My heart surged with a feeling of pure, unadulterated triumph. I was about to make a break for it, to hobble across the remaining few feet of open ground and get to the car, when a new sound reached me. An engine. But it wasn't coming from the SUV in front of me. It was coming from farther down the road, behind me, growing steadily louder. I dropped flat in the ditch as a black sedan, identical to the one I'd seen at the station, came bouncing and splashing down the muddy logging road. It was heading directly for the hidden SUV. It was likely Mr. Gray, coming to rendezvous with his lookout, or perhaps to use the escape vehicle himself. I was trapped, pinned down in a muddy ditch. In front of me was the vehicle that represented my freedom. Behind me was the hidden sniper, who would soon realize he'd been tricked. And bearing down on my exact location was the man in charge of the entire operation. My brief moment of triumph had vanished, replaced by the cold, hard reality of my position. I was out of time and out of options. Trapped. The word echoed in the sudden, roaring silence of my own mind. The ditch was no longer cover. It was a grave waiting to be filled. The quiet hum of the approaching sedan was the sound of the world ending. My survival instincts, honed by years of chasing dangerous truths, screamed a single, desperate command: move or die. My only chance was the clearing. It was a suicidal dash across 10 feet of open space, but staying put was a guaranteed death sentence. As the sedan rounded the last bend, its tires spitting mud, I launched myself from the ditch. I didn't try to stand. I crawled, scrambling on my hands and good knee, dragging my injured leg through the mud and wet leaves. I threw myself behind a large, rotting log at the edge of the clearing, just as the black sedan sloshed to a halt not 20 yards away. I lay flat, my face pressed into the damp, decaying wood, trying to will myself invisible. The car doors opened. I heard the familiar, confident crunch of expensive shoes on gravel. I risked a look through a gap in the log. It was him, the man in the ill-fitting gray suit. In the clear light of day, I could see him properly. He wasn't a thug. He was trim, in his late 40s, with thinning hair and a meticulous, almost academic air about him. He moved with a calm, unnerving precision. He was the man I now thought of as Mr. Gray. The driver was a younger, bigger man, a simple wall of muscle in a dark jacket. Mr. Gray pulled a small radio from his pocket. "Sentinel, report. Over." The voice that came back was sharp with frustration. I had a confirmed auditory contact, Sector 4. Positive it was the asset. But he's vanished. The fog is breaking up. I have a clear view of the road. It's empty. Over. He's not on the road because he's smarter than that, Mr. Gray said, his voice a low, controlled murmur. He clicked his silver lighter. Click. Flick. He disabled the radio at the lodge. That means he's been inside. He has the second map and the keys. He's coming for the vehicle. He scanned the clearing, his eyes cold and analytical. For a terrifying second, his gaze seemed to pass right over my hiding spot, and I was sure he'd seen me. He turned to his driver. "The client is getting agitated. Thorne's deposition is tomorrow morning. We need that flash drive, and we need to cauterize this wound before it infects the entire operation." Thorne's deposition. Tomorrow. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Eleanor hadn't just been running. She had been on her way to stop a testimony, or more likely, to provide the evidence that would make that testimony explosive. They weren't just covering up a crime, they were racing against a legal clock. "You take the sedan back to the main access point," Mr. Gray commanded the driver. "Block it off. Nothing gets out." I'll rendezvous with Sentinel, and we'll sweep the west quadrant toward the creek. He's injured. He's on foot. He's not getting far. This was it. My window. It was going to be terrifyingly small, a sliver of an opportunity between the moment the driver left and the moment Mr. Gray was out of range. The driver grunted an affirmation and got back into the sedan. Mr. Gray began walking toward the ridge, his back to me. The sedan's engine revved. The moment the car began to pull away, I moved. I exploded from behind the log, fueled by a surge of pure, desperate adrenaline. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up my leg as I put weight on my injured ankle, but I ignored it. I hobbled, stumbled, and lunged across the clearing toward the dark green SUV. There, by the log, a shout. Sentinel. He'd seen me. I fumbled in my pocket for the keys, my fingers feeling like clumsy, frozen sausages. I heard the sedan's brakes squeal as the driver saw me in his rearview mirror. Mr. Gray spun around, his calm demeanor finally shattering. His hand went inside his coat and emerged with a black semi-automatic pistol. He was faster than I ever would have imagined. I finally managed to isolate the key fob, stabbing the unlock button. The SUV chirped, the locks disengaging with a loud thud that was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I wrenched the driver's side door open. Crack. A high-velocity rifle round tore through the air, inches from my head, and shattered the rear passenger window of the SUV, spraying a spiderweb of glass across the interior. Sentinel. I threw myself inside, landing awkwardly across the front seats. Another shot from Mr. Gray's pistol pinged off the doorframe as I slammed it shut. My hands shook violently as I jammed the key into the ignition. Outside, I could hear shouts, the driver of the sedan getting out of his car. The engine roared to life. I stomped the accelerator, not even bothering to put it in gear, the engine screaming in protest. I slammed the gear shift into drive. The SUV lurched forward, its tires spinning in the mud, then catching. With a spray of gravel and dirt, the vehicle crashed out of the clearing and onto the logging road. I cranked the wheel, turning away from the sedan, and floored it. The SUV fishtailed wildly on the slick, muddy track before straightening out. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Mr. Gray was standing in the middle of the road, pistol lowered, watching me go. Behind him, the driver was raising his own weapon. I ducked my head instinctively just as my rear windshield exploded inward, showering me with glass. But I was moving. I was away. The SUV bounced and slid, but it was gaining speed. A wave of triumphant, hysterical laughter escaped my lips. I had done it. I had escaped. Then a sharp, searing pain bloomed in my left shoulder. It was hot and wet. I looked down. A dark, rapidly spreading stain was soaking through the fabric of my shirt. Blood. In the chaos, in the final, desperate moments, one of their shots had found its mark. I was free from the trap. But as I sped down the unknown road, bleeding and alone, I realized the race was far from over. I had just traded one hunting ground for another. The SUV was a wounded beast, and I was its bleeding heart. Adrenaline was the only thing keeping me upright, the only thing allowing my hands to grip the steering wheel and my good foot to stay pressed on the accelerator. The logging road was a blur of muddy ruts and menacing trees. Every jarring bounce sent a fresh wave of agony through my shoulder, a fiery counterpoint to the dull, throbbing pain in my ankle. I drove for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only 15 minutes, pushing the damaged vehicle as hard as it would go. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror again. There was nothing back there for me but death. My focus was entirely on the road ahead, a path I hoped led somewhere, anywhere, other than the dark, violent woods I had just escaped. Finally, the trees thinned, and the rough, muddy track gave way to cracked, weed-choked asphalt, which in turn merged with a two-lane state highway. I was back in the world, or at least its forgotten edge. The highway stretched in both directions through a vast, empty landscape of sagebrush and distant, hazy mountains. There were no other cars in sight. I had escaped the frying pan, but the fire was the entire world. The adrenaline began to recede, and the pain in my shoulder sharpened into an undeniable, sickening reality. My shirt was soaked and sticking to the seat. I needed to see how bad it was. More than that, I needed to get out of this vehicle. The shattered windows and bullet hole in the tailgate were a rolling advertisement for my predicament. To Ethelred, it was a tracker. To any cop who saw it, it was a reason to pull me over, and I had no doubt they'd have a story ready for the local authorities. An armed and dangerous carjacker, perhaps. I had the first aid kit from the cabin on the passenger seat. I couldn't treat the wound properly while driving. I scanned the horizon and saw it a half-mile down the road, the skeletal remains of a derelict farm, with a large gray barn whose roof was sagging in the middle like a tired old horse. It was perfect. I pulled off the highway, the tires crunching on the gravel of a long-forgotten driveway, and drove the SUV around to the back of the barn, out of sight of the road. The huge double doors were rotting off their hinges. I managed to force one open just enough to squeeze the vehicle inside, into the dusty, cavernous dark. I killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic sound of my own ragged breathing and the drip of rainwater from the hole-pocked roof. The high-octane terror of the chase gave way to the grim reality of my situation. I was a wounded man in a stolen, bullet-riddled truck, in the middle of nowhere, with a ticking clock I couldn't hear but could feel in every beat of my racing heart. With clumsy, trembling hands, I opened the first aid kit. I carefully peeled away the layers of my blood-soaked shirt. The wound was high on my left shoulder, a messy, ugly puncture. It was bleeding sluggishly but steadily. I couldn't tell how deep it was, but I didn't think it had hit the bone. A through and through. I had been lucky. Or unlucky, depending on your point of view. I bit down on a piece of my torn shirt to stifle a cry of pain as I cleaned the entry and exit wounds with antiseptic wipes. My hands were shaking so badly that the small wipes felt like impossible tools. I packed both sides with gauze and used most of a roll of medical tape to secure the makeshift bandages. It was a pathetic, amateurish job, but it was the best I could do. The work done, the full weight of the last 12 hours crashed down on me. Exhaustion, cold, and pain washed over me in a dizzying wave. My body screamed for sleep, for a hospital, for an end to the ordeal. I knew the sensible thing to do was to walk out to the highway and flag down the first car I saw, to ask for help. A gunshot wound had to be reported. The police would come. I would be taken to a hospital. And I would fail. The evidence, the ledger still strapped to my back, the flash drive in my sock, would be confiscated. It would be entered into evidence, where a well-paid Ethelred lawyer would have it buried under a mountain of legal paperwork. Mr. Gray and his men would disappear. Marcus Thorne's deposition would happen tomorrow morning without the one thing that could prove he was a criminal, and the entire corrupt enterprise of Project Peregrine would continue, built on Eleanor Vance's grave. The choice was no choice at all. Going to a hospital was a death sentence for the truth. My mission wasn't just to survive anymore. It was to get this evidence to people who could use it. And according to Mr. Gray, the flashpoint was Thorne's deposition. Thorne was in Chicago. That meant I had to get to Chicago. From what I remembered of the geological map, this desolate stretch of highway was in eastern Nevada. Chicago was over 1,500 miles away. And the deposition was tomorrow. It was impossible. A sick, desperate laugh escaped my lips. I was injured, without a vehicle I could use, without a phone, with maybe $50 in my wallet, and I had to cross half the country in less than 24 hours. I pulled the topographical map from my pocket and spread it across the dusty hood of the SUV. Next to it, I laid out the tattered gas station map of the United States from my own wallet. The path was a daunting, absurd line cutting across 3 states. The pain in my shoulder was a dull, insistent fire. My ankle felt like a bag of broken glass. But as I stared at the impossible distance on that map, I thought of Eleanor Vance running for her life on that train platform. I thought of my own career, dismantled by the same lie I now had the power to expose. My personal safety didn't matter anymore. Getting out of these woods, escaping the train, that was about survival. This next part, this impossible journey, was about justice. I packed the remaining energy bars and the first aid kit into my pockets. I took one last look at the SUV, my temporary savior now just another trap. Then I pushed the barn door open and stepped back out into the pale, indifferent morning light. I set off on foot, a limping, blood-stained ghost, heading down the gravel driveway toward the empty ribbon of the highway, ready to race the clock across a continent. The highway was a furnace. The weak morning sun had burned through the fog, and now it beat down with an oppressive, high-desert intensity. The asphalt shimmered with heat hazes in the distance, creating mirages of water that my parched throat desperately wished were real. I was a ghost in a world too bright, a creature of shadow and rain now exposed under a vast, unforgiving sky. Every car that passed, and there were precious few, was a potential threat, its driver a potential witness. I walked for over an hour, my makeshift crutch sinking into the soft shoulder of the road. The initial rush of my escape had worn off, replaced by a deep, grinding pain in both my shoulder and my ankle. My bandages were crude, and I could feel the one on my shoulder growing damp again. Dehydration was setting in, my head light, my vision starting to swim at the edges. I was losing a battle of attrition against the landscape itself. Just as I was beginning to think I'd have to crawl into the shade of a sagebrush and wait for the end, I heard it. The low, guttural rumble of a heavy diesel engine. An 18-wheeler, an old Peterbilt with a faded blue cab and a trailer caked in the dust of 1,000 lonely roads, was approaching. It was the perfect blend of anonymous and intimidating. A lone driver, likely on a long haul, minding his own business. It was my best and probably only shot. As the truck neared, I stepped to the edge of the pavement, raised my hand, and tried to look more like a man in need than a man on the run. The truck's air brakes hissed, a sound like a giant, weary sigh. It slowed, pulling onto the shoulder 20 yards past me. I hobbled toward the passenger door. The window rolled down, and a face that looked like it was carved from sun-baked leather peered out. The driver was an older man with a thick, white beard, a greasy baseball cap, and pale blue eyes that missed nothing. "You look like 10 miles of bad road," he grunted, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Car broke down about 5 miles back," I lied, the story feeling thin and pathetic even as I said it. "Got banged up trying to fix the fan belt. Any chance you're heading toward a town?" He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on the torn, muddy state of my clothes and the makeshift bandage visible on my shoulder. His expression was a flat wall of skepticism. "Ain't seen no broke-down car." I reached for my wallet, pulling out the last of my cash. 2 20s and a 10. $50. "I can pay for the gas to the next town," I said, holding the money out. He stared at the cash for a long moment, then at my face. He wasn't looking at me with pity, but with a kind of weary resignation, the look of a man who had seen his share of desperate people on the forgotten highways of America. "Keep your money," he finally said, jerking his head toward the door. "Get in. But if you're trouble, you're getting out at 60 miles an hour. Clear." "Crystal clear," I said, relief washing over me. I hauled myself up the high steps and collapsed into the passenger seat. The cab smelled of stale coffee, diesel, and cheap cigars. It was the most welcoming place I had ever been. The driver's name was Gus. He didn't offer it, and I didn't ask, but I saw it on a faded delivery manifest clipped to his sun visor. He drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the road. The silence was a gift, a chance for me to gather my thoughts and fight back the waves of pain. I learned from a road sign that the next town was Harmony, Nevada. Population, 482. Gus confirmed it had a bus station. My next objective was set. The local radio was playing a static-laced country music station. At the top of the hour, the music faded, and a newscaster's voice came on. My entire body tensed. And in regional news, authorities in Elko County are investigating a stolen vehicle found abandoned this morning. Police are also seeking a person of interest for questioning in connection with an ongoing. My heart stopped. Gus, annoyed by the interruption to his music, slammed his hand on the console, changing the station back to a song about a broken heart and a dusty road. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. He hadn't heard. He hadn't noticed my reaction. An hour later, the first signs of harmony appeared. Gus slowed the truck as we approached the town limits. "This is as far as I go with you," he said, pulling over near a sun-bleached welcome sign. "Bus station is a half-mile that way. Diner next to it's got decent coffee." He looked at me one last time. "Son," he said, his voice softer than before, "whatever you're running from, I hope you're fast enough." I thanked him, the words inadequate, and climbed out. The truck rumbled away, leaving me alone in the quiet, dusty streets of Harmony. The town was a time capsule. Everything looked faded, worn down by the sun and a lack of opportunity. But it had what I needed. I spent the next hour transforming myself. In the restroom of a dusty gas station, I washed the mud and dried blood from my face and hands. I used my $50 at a small general store to buy a plain gray sweatshirt, a cheap pair of jeans, a Nevada souvenir baseball cap, and a small bottle of aspirin. The change of clothes was a mask, a way to shed the skin of the hunted man from the woods. Dressed in my new, anonymous uniform, I went to the town's small pharmacy for more bandages and antiseptic. The elderly woman behind the counter gave my still dirty hands a suspicious glance, but sold me the supplies without a word. Finally, my ankle wrapped tightly and my shoulder re-bandaged under the new sweatshirt, I was ready. The bus depot was a small, sad-looking building at the end of the main street. I walked in, pulled my cap down low, and went to the counter. A weary-looking clerk was reading a magazine. "One way to Chicago," I said, my voice low. "Gonna be a long ride," he said, not looking up. "Leaves in 20 minutes. That'll be $184. It was more than I had. I put all the cash I had left from my wallet on the counter. He'd have to take it or I'd be stuck here. He glanced at the pile of bills and then at me. After a moment he shrugged and started typing. As the dot matrix printer behind him whirred to life, printing my ticket to freedom, my eyes drifted to a small television mounted in the corner of the waiting room. It was tuned to a 24-hour news channel. My blood ran cold. My own face was staring back at me from the screen. It was an old photo from my Tribune press badge, professional and clean-shaven. A version of me that no longer existed. The chiron at the bottom of the screen was a death sentence. Former journalist Jack Donovan wanted for questioning in Nevada homicide. They hadn't just framed me for a stolen car. They had framed me for murder. For Eleanor's murder. The ticket printer stopped. The clerk tore the ticket off and slid it toward me. At that exact moment, his gaze flickered from my face, up to the TV screen, and then back to my face. His eyes widened. The lazy boredom was replaced by dawning, horrified recognition. His mouth opened, a smile of shock, the prelude to a scream that would bring my entire world crashing down. For one beautiful frozen second, the world was just me, the ticket in my hand, and the open road to Chicago. Then reality crashed back in. The ticket clerk's eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and dawning civic duty, were locked on mine. His mouth was a perfect "oh," the sound of an alarm waiting to be pulled. There was no time for reason, no time for a fight. I had only a single moment to short-circuit his reaction. I leaned forward across the counter, my face just inches from his. My voice was a low, desperate hiss. "Please," I whispered, trying to pour every ounce of sincerity I had into the single word. "Don't. I'm being framed. They killed her. Please, just give me a minute." I didn't wait for an answer. I snatched the ticket and the few dollars of change from the counter, spun around, and walked, not ran, out of the bus depot. Running would draw immediate attention. A calm, purposeful walk might buy me the seconds I needed. I didn't look back. I could feel the clerk's terrified gaze on my back, a physical weight. I knew the moment I was out of sight, he would be on the phone. I stepped out into the bright, indifferent sunlight of Harmony's Main Street. My escape plan was in ruins. The bus, which had been my lifeline, was now another trap. Waiting 20 minutes for its departure would be suicide. I had to disappear, and I had to do it now. I ducked into a narrow, dusty alleyway between the depot and a closed-down hardware store, the stench of stale beer and hot garbage filling the air. I pressed my back against the rough brick wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. The town, which had seemed so sleepy and harmless, now felt like a cage. Every window was an eye, every passing local a potential threat. Within a minute, I heard it. A siren. It started as a distant yelp and grew quickly, echoing off the low-slung buildings. A single, beat-up police cruiser, the town's entire law enforcement fleet, sped past the mouth of the alley, its lights flashing. It was patrolling, hunting for the face from the television. My time in Harmony was officially up. I was trapped. I couldn't stay here, and I couldn't leave on foot. The open desert was a death sentence. I needed a vehicle. Stealing a car from a local would be an immediate, town-wide alert. I needed something that could blend in, something that could disappear onto the interstate. My eyes fell on the diner Gus had mentioned. Parked right in front, its massive diesel engine idling with a low, powerful thrum, was a semi-truck. It was a modern Kenworth, its red paint job gleaming in the sun. The driver, a large man in a trucker cap, was visible through the diner window, hunched over a plate of food. It was an insane idea. A desperate, movie-of-the-week cliché of a plan. I had never driven anything bigger than a pickup truck in my life. But the sight of that police car making another pass at the far end of the street solidified my resolve. My options had been narrowed down to the impossible or the inevitable. I chose the impossible. This was a line I never thought I'd cross. I wasn't a car thief. I was a journalist. But Eleanor was dead, and the men who killed her were about to get away with it. The ledger strapped to my back was more important than my own clean conscience. This wasn't theft, it was a necessary act of war. Waiting for the cruiser to pass again, I moved. I slipped out of the alley, keeping low, using a row of parked pickups for cover. I crossed the street in a limping, half-crouched run, the pain in my ankle a distant, unimportant signal. I reached the passenger side of the truck, praying the door was unlocked. It was. I pulled myself up into the cab, my heart screaming. I slid across the surprisingly comfortable seat into the driver's throne, surrounded by a bewildering array of gauges, switches, and levers. The police car was coming back down the street. The trucker in the diner was looking up from his meal, a fork halfway to his mouth, a frown on his face. He'd seen me. I fumbled for the gear shift, a complex-looking knob I didn't understand. I saw the big, red button for the air brakes. I pushed it in. The truck let out a loud hiss. I stomped on the clutch, a pedal that felt as heavy as a cinder block, and yanked the gear shift into what I prayed was first gear. It ground horribly. The trucker was on his feet now, shouting, pointing. I eased off the clutch and hit the accelerator. The massive truck lurched forward with a violent, shuddering groan. I nearly stalled it, but then the engine caught, and the behemoth began to roll. I pulled out onto the street, cutting off a startled-looking sedan. The police car's siren screamed to life, and it swerved to get behind me. I was a terrible truck driver. The gears ground with every shift, and I took the turn onto the highway on-ramp far too wide, my trailer tires hopping the curb. But I was moving. The police cruiser was right on my tail, but on the open highway, I had the advantage of sheer, intimidating mass. I couldn't outrun him, but he couldn't stop me. Not easily. Then, up ahead, I saw his strategy. Another police car, likely a state trooper, was pulling onto the highway from an overpass ahead of me. It raced to catch up, then swerved sideways, blocking both lanes. My pursuer pulled up alongside it, creating a solid wall of flashing lights and steel. A roadblock. There was no exit ramp, no shoulder to speak of. They had me boxed in. Surrender was not an option. I thought of the flash drive in my sock, of Eleanor's determined, frightened face. I took a deep breath, downshifted with a deafening grind of gears, and aimed the massive grille of the Kenworth at the small gap between the two police cars. I pressed the accelerator to the floor. The roar of the engine was a primal scream of defiance. The troopers scrambled for cover. I braced myself for the impact. The world became a symphony of destruction. The shriek of twisting metal, the explosion of shattering glass, the sickening crunch of the impact that shuddered through the entire frame of the truck. I plowed through the roadblock as if it were made of toys. I looked in my side mirror. The police cars were mangled, spinning wrecks in my wake. I was through. I was free. But the road ahead was no longer just a path to Chicago. It was a crime scene, and I was the prime suspect. I had just declared war on the law itself, and there was no going back. The violence of the impact was a deafening, final chord in a symphony of chaos. For a moment, the world was a maelstrom of screeching metal and shattering glass. Then I was through. The battered semi-truck, a testament to the raw power of momentum over order, roared down the highway, leaving the mangled remains of law and order spinning in its wake. The adrenaline coursing through my veins was a roaring fire, burning away the pain, the fear, and the exhaustion, leaving only a white-hot, singular focus, drive. I had crossed a line from which there was no return. I wasn't just a person of interest anymore. In the eyes of the law, I was now a cop-assaulting, road-blocking, truck-stealing public enemy. The manhunt would no longer be a quiet, local affair. It would be a full-blown statewide pursuit. I had traded subtlety for speed, and now I had to make it count. The truck itself was wounded. The front grille was a mangled wreck, a headlight was smashed, and it pulled slightly to the right. But the engine was strong, a defiant roar against the wind whistling through the shattered rear window. For now, its size was its greatest asset, allowing me to blend in with the river of commerce flowing east on the interstate. The cab was equipped with a CB radio, and I switched it on, keeping the volume low. It crackled to life with the voices of the road, a chorus of unseen, nomadic souls. It didn't take long for the chatter to turn to me. "Anyone see what happened back at mile marker 72? A voice drawled. "Heard a rig went through at 1027. A roadblock." "Yeah, I heard it," another voice crackled back. "Sounded like a war zone. They're shutting down all eastbound traffic west of Wells. Got a Smokey Bear convention back there." My stomach clenched. They were closing the interstate behind me. Ahead of me, they'd be setting up more traps. The net was closing, and I was driving deeper into it. I had to get off the highway, and soon. I scanned the map in my head. I had crossed into Utah. The next major city was Salt Lake. A city would have checkpoints on every major artery. My only chance was to get off on a secondary road before then, to shed this massive, conspicuous skin before it became my coffin. I saw a sign for a state route that led toward a sprawling industrial complex and mining operation. It was perfect. An area with heavy truck traffic, where one more battered rig wouldn't look entirely out of place, at least for a few hours. I took the exit, my heart pounding as I passed a state trooper parked on the overpass, his attention thankfully focused on the westbound lanes. I drove for 10 miles down the state route, the landscape turning to slag heaps and massive industrial buildings. I found a dusty, unpaved service road behind a noisy gravel processing plant. The roar of the machinery would cover the sound of my arrival. I pulled the truck as far back as I could, behind a mountain of gravel, and killed the engine. The silence rushed back in, heavy and absolute. I sat for a long moment, the key still in the ignition, every muscle in my body screaming with exhaustion. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a deep, trembling fatigue and the throbbing, insistent pain from my wounds. I checked my bandages. The one on my shoulder was soaked through again. I didn't have the supplies to redress it properly. It was late afternoon. I had been running, hiding, and fighting for over 16 hours. The deposition in Chicago was tomorrow morning. The finish line was still 1,000 miles away, and my body was failing. I took stock. I had the evidence, still secure. I had the clothes on my back and no money. I was a wanted man in 2 states, possibly more by now. The semi-truck had bought me 150 miles and a few hours of time. Now I was on foot again, a fugitive in the industrial heartland of Utah. My new goal was Salt Lake City. It was a major transportation hub. It was my only chance to catch a train, to cover the remaining distance with speed. According to a sign I passed, a small town with a local bus service to the city was 5 miles down the road. It would have to do. The 5-mile walk was a special kind of hell. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple that seemed to mock the grim, gray reality of my situation. I kept to the side of the road, my head down, my hat pulled low, trying to look like a local worker at the end of a long shift. By the time I reached the small, tired town, night had fallen. I found the bus stop and used the last few dollars I had, the change from the depot in Harmony, to buy a ticket. I huddled at the back of the bus, a ghost among the commuters and late shift workers, and tried not to bleed on the seat. An hour later, I was in the heart of Salt Lake City. The transition was jarring. The silence of the desert was replaced by the roar of traffic and the hum of a million lives. The anonymity of the crowd was a welcome cloak. I made my way through the bright, bustling streets toward the train station, a limping shadow in the urban landscape. The station was a grand, old building, a cathedral of journeys. I felt a surge of hope, the first I'd felt in hours. The departure board listed a train, the Zephyr, leaving for Chicago in 1 hour. It was possible. It was actually possible. I kept to the edges of the great hall, my eyes scanning the crowd, looking for the telltale uniforms of police or transit authorities. I saw none. My confidence grew. I was just another traveler, tired and anonymous. I started to move toward the ticket counter. That's when I saw them. They weren't cops. They were 2 men, standing near the main entrance. They wore simple, dark suits that didn't quite fit the relaxed, travel-worn atmosphere of the station. They were quiet, observant, their eyes sweeping the crowd with a methodical, predatory patience. One of them held up a smartphone, his gaze flicking from the screen to the faces of the people passing by. They weren't looking for a uniform. They were looking for a face. My face. Ethelred's network was faster than I had imagined. They hadn't just relied on the police. They had anticipated my next move. They knew I'd aim for a transit hub. The police manhunt was a noisy, brutish distraction. This was the real hunt. The quiet, professional one. And they had gotten here first. The train station, which moments before had been a symbol of hope, had become the illuminated stage of a trap. The 2 men in their ill-fitting suits were a clear and present danger, a quiet declaration from Ethelred Corporation that they were no longer just chasing me, they were waiting for me. My plan, my desperate, 1,000-mile gambit, had led me directly into their crosshairs. Panic, cold and familiar, pricked at the edges of my consciousness. But I had been in this state for too long now. Fear had become a tool, a whetstone that sharpened my senses. Running would be an admission of guilt, a flare fired into the night. I had to be invisible. I stopped my advance toward the ticket counter, turned, and casually began to browse the rack of travel brochures, my back to the hunters. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I picked up a glossy pamphlet advertising ski resorts in Park City, pretending to read it, while my mind raced. I needed an exit, one they weren't watching. I saw it. A set of double doors to my left, marked for the station's administrative offices and baggage claim. It was a less traveled path. Using a slow-moving family with a mountain of luggage as a screen, I began to drift toward it. Every step was a calculated risk. I could feel the watcher's eyes sweeping the crowd, and I was sure that at any moment, a hand would clamp down on my wounded shoulder. I reached the doors and slipped through, finding myself in a long, sterile corridor. I didn't look back. I followed the signs for baggage claim and then for ground transportation, a convoluted route that finally spat me out onto a chaotic side street filled with taxis and shuttle buses. I was out. I had escaped the trap. But I was back on the street, and my situation had never been more hopeless. Salt Lake City was a prison. The police were looking for a murderer. Ethelred's private army was looking for me. The train station, the bus terminal, the airport, every conventional exit from the city was compromised. I was completely, utterly boxed in. A profound weariness, deeper than any I had ever known, settled over me. The pain in my shoulder and ankle, which had been a sharp, insistent signal, was now a dull, grinding ache that seemed to emanate from my very soul. The chase, the fight, the constant running, it had all led me to this dead end. I needed a place to rest, to think. A place where I wouldn't be found. A motel was out of the question, requiring an ID and a credit card I didn't have. I needed a place that didn't ask questions. A place for the lost. My disheveled appearance, my torn clothes, my limp, they were a liability in the bright, clean world of the train station. But in another part of this city, they could be a camouflage. I found a city map at a bus stop and located what I was looking for. A few miles away, in a part of the city the tourists never saw, was a men's shelter. It was a humbling, desperate thought, but it was also the smartest play I had left. The shelter was a large, grim brick building, its windows covered with wire mesh. The line of men waiting to get in was a cross-section of the forgotten. I joined them, my head down, my souvenir baseball cap pulled low. No one gave me a second glance. Here, my injuries and exhaustion were not suspicious, they were the uniform. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of industrial soup and disinfectant. I gave the name John Smith at the intake desk, and in return, I was given a tray of food, a thin blanket, and a cot number. The cot was in a cavernous room filled with 100 others, a forest of quiet, breathing misery. But it was safe. For the first time in what felt like a year, I was in a room where no one was actively trying to kill me. I ate the stew, which tasted like heaven. I went to the washroom and in the dim, flickering light, I cleaned and redressed my wounds as best I could. The gunshot wound in my shoulder was inflamed and angry looking. It needed real medical attention, which I couldn't get. I lay down on my cot, the springs groaning in protest. An old man on the cot next to me, his face a roadmap of hard times, nodded at my bandaged shoulder. "Looks like you had a rough night," he rasped, his voice scratchy. "Something like that," I said. He gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "Everyone's runnin' from something, son. Cop, ex-wife, the bottle, themselves. The trick ain't runnin' fast. It's runnin' smart. Find a road they ain't lookin' for you on." His words, simple and cynical, struck me with the force of a revelation. I had been trying to use their roads, their systems, the train, the bus. I needed to find a road they weren't watching. A road with no tickets, no manifests, no security cameras. Lying there on that lumpy cot, the answer came to me, a ghost from a bygone American era. Freight. The endless, anonymous network of freight trains that were the true circulatory system of the country. I could become a hobo, a ghost on the rails, invisible to the system that was hunting me. It was a dangerous, insane idea. But it felt right. I sat up. "Where's the main rail yard?" I asked the old man. "The big one, for the freight trains." He looked at me, a flicker of something, memory perhaps, in his tired eyes. "Down by the industrial parks. The Roper yard. Big and nasty. You ain't thinkin' of catchin' out, are you? It ain't like the movies, kid. It'll kill you if you're not careful. Which way do the eastbound trains run?" I pressed. He sighed, a long, weary sound. "They build the big manifests, round midnight. Look for the long haulers heading for the Denver line. That'll take you east. Look for an open boxcar or a grainer with a porch. And stay away from the yard bulls. They'll crack your skull for sport." I had a new plan. A terrible, desperate, and brilliant plan. I had a few hours to rest, to let my body steal a precious moment of recovery before I threw it back into the fire. I thanked the old man. I closed my eyes, but not to sleep. I was visualizing the yard, planning my infiltration. I had found a new road, the one they wouldn't be looking for. And tonight, I would disappear from the world of men and into the dark, rumbling world of the Iron Horse. The shelter had been a momentary ceasefire in a war I was badly losing. As I slipped out the back door into the cold, late-night air, I knew I was willingly walking off the battlefield and into no man's land. My destination was the Roper Rail Yard, a place that existed on the dark, industrial fringe of the city, a place where the normal rules of society didn't apply. It was perfect. The journey was a long, limping pilgrimage through the city's forgotten parts. The bright lights of downtown gave way to the sodium-orange glow of empty industrial parks. I moved through a silent world of cavernous warehouses and shadowy loading docks. The only sounds were the distant hum of the highway and the rhythmic tap of my makeshift crutch on the cracked pavement. Every barking dog, every passing car, sent a jolt of fear through me. My body was a wreck. The few hours of rest had done little to quell the fires in my shoulder and ankle. Every step was a fresh agony, a reminder of my weakness. The task ahead, infiltrating a secure rail yard and boarding a moving train, seemed less like a plan and more like a fever dream. I finally reached the perimeter of the yard. It was a continent of steel and shadow, stretching for miles under harsh industrial lights that cast more darkness than they dispelled. A 12-foot chain-link fence, topped with barbed wire, marked the border between the city and this iron kingdom. The air hummed with the low thrum of idling diesel engines and the percussive, violent clang of rail cars being coupled together. I followed the fence line for nearly a mile, looking for a breach, a weak point. I found it near a culvert where the fence had been bent back, likely by others who had made this same desperate journey. I squeezed through the gap, tearing my sweatshirt on a stray piece of wire, and I was in. The world inside was a labyrinth of danger. Tracks, hundreds of them, spread out in every direction like metallic veins. Trains, some a mile long, sat silent and imposing, while switcher engines darted back and forth like angry mechanical insects. I was an ant in a world of giants, and a single misstep would be my last. Recalling the old man's advice, I began my search for the eastbound manifest, the longest train, the one being assembled for the long haul. I kept to the shadows, moving in a low crouch between the lines of silent, waiting cars. Twice, a security truck rumbled past on a service road, its headlights sweeping the area. Both times, I had to drop flat, pressing myself into the oily gravel of the track bed, my heart pounding as the beams passed just over my head. After 30 minutes of tense, nerve-wracking exploration, I found it. It was a colossal serpent of steel, a mixed freight train stretching so far into the darkness I couldn't see its end. A powerful locomotive at its head idled with a deep, ground-shaking thrum. This had to be it. Now for the hardest part. I moved along the length of the train, my eyes scanning each car. Tankers, flatbeds loaded with pipes, sealed container cars. Then I saw it. A boxcar, its thick, sliding door mercifully left halfway open, a dark, inviting rectangle of absolute blackness. It was my way out. Just as I reached it, a deafening hiss of air brakes echoed down the entire length of the train. It was preparing to move. I didn't have any more time. The floor of the boxcar was a good 5 feet off the ground. A simple step up for a healthy man, but for me, it was a mountain. I tossed my crutch inside, took a deep breath, and jumped. My good hand caught the edge of the steel floor, but my wounded shoulder screamed in protest. My injured ankle, useless, dangled beneath me. My grip slipped, and I fell back onto the sharp gravel, a cry of pain and frustration escaping my lips. Clang! A violent, bone-jarring lurch shook the entire train as the slack was pulled out of the couplings. I was thrown off balance, nearly falling under the wheels. The train was moving. It was now or never. Ignoring the fire in my shoulder, I surged upward again. I got a better grip, hooked my good leg onto the edge, and with a final, desperate, animalistic heave, I hauled my broken body over the threshold. I collapsed onto the splintered wooden floor, the world a dizzying, pain-filled blur. The train began its slow, groaning journey, pulling me out of the yard and into the deep, welcoming darkness of the open country. I had done it. I was on my way. I lay there for a long time, my cheek pressed against the rough, vibrating floor, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a brutal but triumphant song. I was finally moving east. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself into a sitting position and crawled deeper into the boxcar shadows, away from the open door. As my eyes adjusted to the profound blackness, I became aware of a shape in the far corner. A heap of rags. A piece of cargo. The shape moved. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows, slowly resolving into the silhouette of a man. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. Was it another transient, a fellow traveler on this invisible railroad? The figure rose to his feet. He was tall, and even in the darkness, he moved with a quiet, confident grace that did not belong here. He took a step forward, the faint light from the open door catching the glint of his polished shoes. Then he spoke, his voice calm, conversational, and utterly terrifying. "You've caused us a great deal of trouble, Mr. Donovan. You're a long way from home. It wasn't a yard bull. It wasn't a hobo. My blood ran cold. The impossible journey, the desperate escape, the infiltration of the yard, it had all been for nothing. I hadn't escaped the trap. I had just locked myself inside of it." The man's voice was a calm, chilling anchor in the chaotic, rattling world of the boxcar. It was the voice of a man completely in control, a man who had already won and was simply here to collect his prize. The hope that had carried me through the rail yard, that had felt so triumphant just moments before, dissolved into a cold, heavy dread in the pit of my stomach. I pushed myself up slowly, using the rough, vibrating wall of the car for support. The silhouette before me remained perfectly still, a pillar of darkness against the lesser dark. He wasn't a brutish thug. His posture was too relaxed, too confident. He was a professional, and this cold, empty boxcar was his office. How? The word was a dry rasp from my throat. Predictability, Mr. Donovan, the man said, his voice smooth and even over the roar of the wheels. You lost the ability to travel by road. You couldn't fly. You were identified at the Salt Lake station. That left one last, desperate option for a man in a hurry. A freight line. We anticipated it. Ethelred has associates in many places. It was simply a matter of waiting for the right desperate man to climb aboard. He took another step, and I could make out the sharp crease of his trousers, the glint of polished leather shoes. It was absurd, a man dressed for a boardroom meeting standing in a filthy, rumbling boxcar in the middle of the night. This is where it ends, he said, his tone matter of fact. It doesn't have to be difficult. My primary objective is the recovery of corporate property, the ledger and the flash drive. Give them to me. And then what? I scoffed, my own voice sounding thin and weak. You let me go. A thin smile touched his lips, a barely visible slash of white in the gloom. And then I complete my secondary objective. But I can make it quick. A clean slate, of a sort. The woman on the train, she was uncooperative. It became unpleasant. You don't want it to be unpleasant. The casual mention of Eleanor, the detached cruelty in his voice, stoked the last dying ember of my resolve into a small, defiant flame. I thought of her fear, her sacrifice. I thought of my own shattered career. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was a custodian of their crimes. The evidence isn't on me, I lied, trying to inject a confidence I didn't feel. It's already on its way to a reporter at the New York Times. You're too late. The man sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. I had hoped you wouldn't be a fool, Mr. Donovan. Ethelred would not leave such things to chance. He began to move toward me, pulling on a pair of black leather gloves. I'll have to take it from you then. This boxcar is very loud. No one will hear you. He was right. I was out of options, out of time, and out of strength. A straight fight was impossible. He was healthy, and I was a wounded, exhausted wreck. I glanced around the dark space. My eyes fell on the one thing I had brought with me, the heavy branch I had been using as a crutch. It lay on the floor a few feet away, and beyond it, the open door, a rushing ribbon of moonlit landscape. My mind, frantic and desperate, formulated a plan. A suicidal, insane plan. As he closed the distance between us, I kicked out with my good leg, not at him, but at a loose piece of dunnage on the floor. The wooden plank skittered across the floor, and in the second he flinched at the unexpected noise, I lunged for my crutch. I didn't swing it at him. I put all my remaining strength into a wild, sweeping blow aimed at the side of the boxcar. The heavy branch slammed into the rusty, iron latch of the open door. At that exact moment, the train hit a sharp curve, swaying violently to the left. The combination of the impact and the train's momentum was explosive. With a deafening boom that shook the entire car, the massive steel door slammed shut. The world vanished. We were plunged into absolute, suffocating blackness. The roar of the train became a disorienting, all-encompassing sensory deprivation. For the first time, my opponent was as blind as I was. Clever, he hissed, his voice dangerously close in the dark. But you've only trapped yourself with me. I could hear him shuffling, trying to pinpoint my location. I held my breath, using the thunderous noise of the wheels to cover the sound of my own movement as I crawled away. This was my world now, a world of sound and touch. I was the wounded animal in its dark burrow, and for a moment, I had the advantage. Then his mistake. A sharp click, and a tiny brilliant beam of light cut through the blackness. A pen light. He was using it to sweep the car, trying to find me. But in illuminating his search, he illuminated himself. I was already at the door, my hands finding the cold, heavy latch. As his beam swept past my position, I acted. I shoved a pile of loose debris with my foot, and he stumbled, turning the light in that direction. In that split second of misdirection, I yanked the latch. The heavy door slid open with a grinding roar, and the night flooded back in, the wind, the moonlight, the blur of the passing landscape. The hunter was caught completely by surprise, blinded by his own light, stumbling right at the edge of the open doorway. He recovered instantly, lunging not away from the door, but at me. His hand clamped onto the front of my sweatshirt, his grip like iron. He was trying to pull me back into the car, to finish it. I couldn't break his hold. I was too weak. So I didn't try. With his hand still gripping my shirt, I kicked off the wall of the boxcar, throwing all of my weight backward, out into the open air. His eyes widened in shock as he realized my intent. His momentum, combined with my push, was too much. His grip was unbreakable, and he became my anchor. For a heartbeat, we were suspended over the abyss, two figures locked in a desperate embrace against the rushing backdrop of the night. Then gravity took hold, and together, we tumbled out of the speeding train and into the violent, unforgiving darkness below. The fall was a sudden, violent erasure of the world. There was a moment of weightless terror, the wind screaming in my ears, and then the brutal, percussive impact with the gravel embankment. The world became a chaotic nightmare of tumbling, scraping, and pain. My head struck something hard, and the already blurry landscape dissolved into a flashing, star-filled darkness. We hit the bottom of the slope in a tangle of limbs and landed in the wet, cold ditch. The force of the final impact threw us apart. For a long, silent moment, the only sound was the fading rumble of the freight train, a mechanical beast abandoning its unwanted cargo in the wilderness. It disappeared, taking the last echo of civilization with it, and left behind a silence so profound it felt like the end of the world. My body was a symphony of agony. The fall had taken the dull, throbbing pains in my shoulder and ankle and turned them into sharp, screaming crescendos. A fresh, hot pain radiated from my ribs, and every breath was a shallow, stabbing effort. I lay there, dazed, my face pressed into the damp earth, fighting the tide of unconsciousness that threatened to pull me under. A groan from nearby cut through my haze. The hunter. He was alive. I forced myself to roll over, my muscles screaming in protest. In the pale moonlight, I saw him struggling to his hands and knees, about 10 feet away. His suit was torn and covered in mud, and one of his arms was bent at an unnatural angle. He was just as broken as I was. The playing field was level again. We were two wrecked men in a ditch, stripped of all professionalism and bravado. This was now a primal fight for survival. His eyes found mine in the darkness, and I saw a flicker of the same raw desperation I felt. He began to crawl, not toward me, but toward a dark object lying on the gravel between us. His pistol, knocked from his hand in the fall. A jolt of pure survival instinct shot through me, momentarily eclipsing the pain. I scrambled forward, dragging my useless leg, my fingers digging into the dirt. It became a slow-motion, pathetic race. A gruesome crawl between two crippled combatants. He was closer. His good hand reached, his fingers stretching for the weapon. I wasn't going to make it. I wouldn't let it end like this. My own hand, scrabbling blindly in the loose rock and soil, closed around something heavy, solid, and jagged. A piece of granite, likely part of the railway ballast. Just as his fingers brushed against the grip of the pistol, I lunged. I threw myself on top of him with a guttural cry, all my weight crashing down on his back. He grunted in pain, his injured arm giving way. I raised the rock high, my own wounded shoulder shrieking in protest, and brought it down with every last ounce of strength I possessed. It was a clumsy, desperate, ugly act. The impact was a sickening thud. The hunter went limp beneath me, his breath leaving him in a single final sigh. I rolled off him, gasping, my body trembling uncontrollably. The fight was over. I was alive. For how long, I didn't know. My first thought, a clear, sharp beacon in the fog of pain, was for the evidence. I checked my back. The ledger was still there, its hard edges a reassuring pressure. I fumbled in my sock. The flash drive was safe. I had won. I had protected Eleanor's legacy, but the cost was immense. I was in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in the vast, empty darkness between Utah and Colorado. The deposition was in a few hours. I had survived, but I was still going to fail. Then I remembered. Resources. My opponent would have resources. I crawled back to the unconscious man and, with a grim sense of purpose, began to search his pockets. I found a wallet thick with cash, a set of car keys, and a smartphone. It felt like a holy relic in my hand, a lifeline. I pressed the power button, praying it had survived the fall. The screen lit up. 87% battery. A wave of light-headed relief washed over me. Who to call? Not the police. They were hunting me. My old contacts were a risk. Ethelred might be monitoring them. I needed to go to the source. The deposition. My mind, working with a feverish clarity, accessed the old journalistic training. Public legal proceedings. I opened the phone's web browser, my fingers clumsy and stiff. I typed in Marcus Thorne, Ethelred Corporation, deposition, and Chicago. The search results were a list of dry legal notices, but one stood out. A notice of deposition in a civil case, filed by a law firm, Stern, Casey, and Finch. They were representing a group of investors suing Ethelred over Project Peregrine. They were the ones who needed my evidence. I found the firm's number and dialed, my heart pounding. It was 3 in the morning in Chicago. It rang 4 times, then clicked over to a calm, professional answering service. Of course. This was my one shot. My last message in a bottle. I took a deep, rattling breath. "My name is Jack Donovan," I began, my voice a ragged, breathless whisper. "This message is for the lead attorney on the Ethelred case. I have definitive evidence for the Marcus Thorne deposition. A ledger, a flash drive, proof of bribery, fraud, proof they murdered an engineer named Eleanor Vance for it." I could feel my own strength fading, the darkness closing in. They tried to kill me. I'm injured. I'm somewhere off the Union Pacific line. I fumbled with the phone, trying to open its map application to get a GPS coordinate. My location is... The screen flickered. A low battery icon flashed once, and then the phone went dead. The connection was severed. The lifeline was gone. I was left in the profound, crushing silence of the wilderness, lying next to the still body of my attacker. I had sent my message, but I didn't know if it had been enough. I didn't know if they'd get it, if they'd believe it, if they could even find me. The first, pale hint of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern sky. The day of the deposition was here. I had done everything I could. All that was left to do now was lie here, bleed, and pray that the truth would finally find its way into the light. The world returned not as a sudden rush, but as a slow, painful bleed of consciousness. The first thing I was aware of was the light, a pale, watercolor wash of dawn painting the eastern sky. The second was the pain, a colossal, all-encompassing agony that had settled deep into my bones. My body was a map of torment, each injury a landmark. The fall had taken what was left of me and shattered it. I was lying at the bottom of the embankment, my cheek pillowed by cold, damp gravel. A few feet away, the Ethelred hunter lay still and silent, a broken puppet discarded after the show. The freight train was long gone, its rumble a fading memory. The silence it left behind was absolute, the kind of profound quiet that exists only in the most desolate corners of the earth. Time lost its meaning. The sun, a perfect, brilliant disk, climbed the sky, and its warmth did little to chase away the deep, shivering cold that had settled into my core. My thirst was a raw, rasping thing in my throat. I tried to move, to crawl towards a patch of shade, but my body refused to obey. I was a prisoner in my own broken shell. All I could do was lie there and wait. My mind, unmoored from the physical world, began to drift. I saw Eleanor Vance's face, not as a frightened woman on a train, but the way she looked in the photograph from her briefcase, younger, smiling, standing between her parents. She wasn't just a mission or a clue. She was a person who had seen something wrong and had decided to risk everything to make it right. She had trusted a stranger on a train with her life's last and most important work. I had carried it this far. The thought was a small, solid anchor in a sea of pain. I thought of my own life, of the man I had been before I boarded the Argent Express. The journalist who chased stories with a righteous, single-minded fury. I had believed in the power of the truth, that exposing a lie was the most important thing a person could do. Then Marcus Thorne had taught me that truth could be bought and sold like any other commodity. He had broken my spirit long before my body had been broken in this ditch. I had boarded that train to run away from that failure. But you can never outrun yourself. The story I had tried to leave behind had found me again in the dark, on a train bound for nowhere. This entire, brutal, impossible journey hadn't been an escape. It had been a reckoning. I had been given one last chance to be the man I once was. The sun was high in the sky now, a merciless eye beating down on me. I was starting to hallucinate, the edges of the world shimmering and distorting. I closed my eyes, a weary resignation settling over me. I had sent the message. I had fought the last fight. There was nothing more I could do. It started as a low, rhythmic thrumming, a vibration I felt in my teeth more than I heard with my ears. I dismissed it as a symptom of my fading consciousness. But it grew louder, more distinct. A steady, percussive chopping sound. My eyes snapped open. I scanned the vast, empty blue of the sky. There, a black speck, growing larger by the second. A helicopter. A new kind of terror, cold and sharp, cut through my exhausted haze. Was it them? Had Ethelred tracked the dead phone? Had they sent a cleanup crew to finish the job and bury the last loose end? I was completely exposed, unable to move, unable to hide. I could only lie there, a helpless target, and watch my fate descend from the sky. The helicopter, a sleek civilian Bell Jet Ranger, swept over me once, then circled back, its downdraft a violent storm of dust and gravel that stung my face. It wasn't a black, unmarked corporate machine. It was a medical transport. It hovered 100 feet above, and a figure began to descend on a rope. Then another. They weren't black-clad operatives. They were paramedics in bright orange jumpsuits. My breath hitched in a sob of pure, unadulterated relief. They reached the ground and ran toward me. One of them, a young woman with kind, professional eyes, knelt beside me. "Sir, can you hear me? We're here to help you. Don't try to move." Behind her, a third person, who had descended more slowly, approached. She was a woman in a crisp business suit that looked utterly out of place in the rugged wilderness. She had a briefcase in one hand and an intense, focused expression on her face. She knelt opposite the paramedic. "Mr. Donovan," she asked, her voice sharp and clear. "I'm Sarah Casey, from Stern, Casey, and Finch. We got your message." They got it. Through the pain, through the despair, a feeling of profound, earth-shattering triumph washed over me. I had done it. The evidence! I rasped, my voice barely a whisper. I tried to gesture to my back, my sock. "We know," she said, her eyes softening with a flicker of understanding. "The paramedics will retrieve it. It's safe now, Jack. You're safe." They began to work on me, checking my vitals, stabilizing my leg, putting a pressure bandage on my shoulder. They were efficient, professional, their actions a soothing balm on my frayed nerves. They loaded me onto a stretcher, and the winch began to pull me up into the sky and away from the place where I had almost died. As I ascended, swaying gently, the world spread out below me. I was leaving the wilderness behind. I was rescued. It was over. "The deposition," I managed to say to Sarah Casey, who was being lifted beside me. "Marcus Thorne." She looked at her watch, her expression grim, the wind whipping her hair across her face. "It started 10 minutes ago in Chicago," she shouted over the roar of the rotor blades. "Thorne's lawyers are stonewalling. We filed an emergency motion to introduce new evidence based on your call, but the judge is hesitant. I don't know if we're going to make it in time." The helicopter rose higher, and the ground below became an abstract map. I was safe. The evidence was secure. But the final battle was being fought 1,000 miles away, and the clock was about to run out. My return to the world was a blur of motion and urgent, muffled voices. The roar of the helicopter, the sterile, bright lights of an emergency room, the concerned faces of doctors and nurses moving with a calm, practiced efficiency. I was a collection of data points to them: blood pressure, heart rate, the nature of my wounds. But to Sarah Casey, the lawyer who never left my side, I was something else. I was a witness. A living, breathing piece of evidence. I was stabilized in a trauma unit in a Grand Junction, Colorado hospital. Needles were put in my arm, my wounds were properly cleaned and stitched, and my ankle was set in a cast. The pain began to recede into a manageable, morphine-induced haze. But through it all, my mind was 1,000 miles away, in a sterile conference room in Chicago. Sarah was my anchor to that reality. She stood in the corner of my hospital room, her phone pressed to her ear, a fierce, determined general commanding a distant army. I listened to her side of the conversation, piecing together the endgame. "They're not granting the injunction. Judge says the evidence is unverified," she snapped into the phone. "Stall them. File another motion. Object to everything. Just buy me time." She hung up and looked at me, her expression grim. "They're trying to push it through." Thorne testified for an hour, pleading ignorance on every key question. "Ethelred's lawyers are painting you as a disgruntled, unstable ex-employee who stole proprietary documents and went on a violent rampage." "The flash drive," I croaked, my throat dry. "Did you get it open?" "My tech team is working on it now. It's heavily encrypted." She looked at her watch. It was just past 10 a.m. in Chicago. "We're running out of time, Jack. The judge is about to let Thorne step down. If he walks out of that room, he'll disappear." "Then put me in the room," I said, a sudden, fierce clarity cutting through the haze of medication. "Right now." Sarah's eyes widened, then narrowed as she understood. She turned back to her phone, her fingers flying, a flurry of texts and a new phone call. "Get me a court order for an emergency video testimony," she commanded. "Cite medical necessity and time-sensitive evidence in a federal case. I don't care who you have to wake up. Make it happen. Now." 20 minutes later, my hospital room was transformed. A rolling cart with a high-definition camera and a large monitor was wheeled in. A court stenographer from a local office arrived, looking bewildered. A nurse checked my vitals, her expression a mixture of concern and astonishment. On the screen, an image flickered to life, a polished mahogany conference table. I saw a group of expensive lawyers, a frustrated-looking judge, and at the head of the table, Marcus Thorne. He looked older, tired, but still wore the same mask of arrogant composure I remembered so well. When my face appeared on the large monitor in their room, that mask cracked. For the first time, I saw him flinch. "Mr. Donovan," the judge's voice boomed from the speakers, "you have been sworn in. You understand you are under oath." "I do," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. And I told them everything. I started with the rain-swept platform and the last passenger on the midnight train. I spoke of Eleanor Vance's fear and the briefcase she died to protect. As I talked, Sarah's team in Chicago, having finally broken the encryption, began displaying documents from the flash drive on the screen for the judge to see. Emails, bank transfers, secret safety reports that Eleanor had compiled. I held the mud-stained ledger up to the camera. "This is her handwriting," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't suppress. "These are the names of the men she died to expose." I recounted the chase, the hunt, the fight in the boxcar. Then, I looked directly at the camera, at the image of the man who had ruined my life. "This was never just about a power plant," I said, my voice ringing with a conviction I hadn't felt in years. "It was about a pattern of corruption that Marcus Thorne has enabled for years. He took Ethelred's money to kill my story about construction fraud years ago. He destroyed my career to protect them. And when Eleanor Vance brought him the truth this time, a truth that would have exposed him, he didn't bury the story. He helped them bury her." On the screen, Thorne lunged to his feet, his face purple with rage. "This is a lie. A slanderous fantasy from a disgraced." "Mr. Thorne, you will be silent," the judge commanded, his voice like cracking granite. He was staring at the documents on his screen, his face a grim mask. The trap had been sprung. The truth was out. 3 months later. The story of Project Peregrine broke like a dam. It was a national scandal that led to a dozen arrests, a congressional investigation, and the utter collapse of Ethelred Corporation. Marcus Thorne, facing a mountain of evidence, gave up Mr. Gray and the entire corporate security apparatus in exchange for a plea deal. The wheels of justice, once clogged with money and lies, had finally begun to turn. My life had been irrevocably altered. The fugitive was now a witness, the disgraced journalist now a national name. The murder charge had vanished, my actions deemed self-defense. Offers for books and interviews poured in, but I turned them all down. I had told my last story. All I wanted was the quiet I had been searching for in the first place. My shoulder healed with a permanent, angry scar, and my ankle would always ache when it rained. They were reminders, not of the pain, but of the cost. The price of the truth. I found myself standing on another train platform. It wasn't midnight. The sun was warm, the air was clean, and the station was filled with the bright, ordinary chatter of families and vacationers. In my hand was a one-way ticket to Portland, Oregon. I wasn't running from anything anymore. I had met with Eleanor's parents, two kind, heartbroken people who had thanked me through tears for giving their daughter's sacrifice meaning. I had faced down the ghosts of my past and, in the process, found some measure of peace. The train arrived with a gentle hiss of brakes. As I stepped aboard, I found a seat by the window and watched the other passengers file on. A young soldier, a grandmother, a businessman on his laptop. A familiar tableau, but this time, it held no menace. They were just people, heading somewhere. Just like me. The train began to move, pulling away from the station and into the vast, open country. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track was no longer a sound of escape, but a lullaby of beginnings. The last passenger on the midnight train had finally found his way into the light.